What's up, meta nerds? This video is about Wraith Sienar's original Death Star idea. Sienar of Sienar Fleet Systems would make many popular craft over the decades, with the most notable being the TIE Fighter. For this story, we go to the Legends book Rogue Planet. Even though the Clone Wars would not break out for another 7 years, everyone sensed the political tension throughout the galaxy, that times were changing. One day, Wraith Sienar was walking through a sort of museum of failures, located at the company's headquarters. Countless weapons, droids, and ship designs that were discontinued, or just abandoned mid-design. He was thinking about how a massive change in galactic politics would result in a change in customer. Quote, "Those who replace effete elites rule by brutality. This is a law in the history of the galaxy. A kind of political balance, frightening but true." Sienar always prided himself on designing precise weapons with an elegant style, and this is what the aristocratic rulers had always preferred. When you have peace for nearly 1,000 years, almost all the weapons of war become ceremonial, but Sienar knew that whoever led the galaxy in the coming decades would be waging real war. There would be a need for sheer firepower, complexities and niceties be damned. And that's when his gaze fell on a design that was called the Expeditionary Battle Planetoid. Long before there was an Empire or even the CIS, the brilliant designer had come up with a ship that was so massive and powerful that it could replace an entire fleet. In the year 29 BBY, he pitched this idea to Wilf Tarkin, then commander in the Outland Region Security Forces. The design was a series of 3 spheres that would connect via a 100-kilometer wide pole. The main sphere would be the largest, with the 2 smaller spheres on each end. The pole itself, as well as the surface of each of these spheres, would be lined with countless turbolasers. Power would be generated via a plasma implosion reactor in the central sphere, and would send power out through the pole. Coated in thick durasteel armor and thrusters, this battle station would be both durable and easy to maneuver. While being spheres and cylinders, there was no blind spot, full 360-degree coverage. When Tarkin saw it, he called it impossibly huge, and asked if it wasn't just a schoolboy fancy. But Sienar assured him that it was possible, but of course expensive, and that it could be fully powered given advances in hypermatter technology. In their conversation, Sienar mentioned that he also considered just dropping the 2 smaller spheres and making it simply one large planetoid battle station. At this remark, just as he suspected, this future brutal leader in a cruel and inelegant empire absolutely loved this sheer destructive ability. Tarkin bursted out, "What a sense of scale! What unutterable power!" Commander Tarkin assures Sienar that he should focus his efforts on this project, that this battle station would satisfy the right people in the years to come. But then Tarkin went to his longtime mentor and now Chancellor Palpatine and presented the idea of a creation that could, quote, "police an entire system with one vessel." Knowing that his idea was stolen, Sienar probably shouted something like this.
"I will tell him that I will be taking control over the weapon I first spoke of years ago, effective immediately."
We stand here amidst my achievement, not yours!
The Republic would dedicate extraordinary sums of credits to advance hypermatter reactor technology, while Darth Sidious made sure these plans got into the hands of the Geonosians. These galaxy-renowned bug engineers helped to rework the design away from a fleet killer into something more streamlined that would house a single enormous super laser. The sphere would still be covered in turbolasers, and the vessel would be large enough to carry starfighter escorts, which should have been more than enough to repel any attacks against the battle station. Tarkin was given command over this project because, in part, he presented it as his idea. And though many have critiqued the Death Star as a waste, that something like a fleet-killing megastructure would have been more practical, it is cool that the final Death Star would be used to decimate a fleet, blowing apart capital ships with ease, just as Wraith Sienar intended. So what do you think of this story? Do you like this Legends history better than the new canon creation via Rogue One in the novel Catalyst? Definitely let me know in the comments down below. But most important of all, remember, never tell Tarkin your secrets, and the Force will be with you, always. What's up, meta nerds? This video is about all the ships used by the Trade Federation before the Clone Wars. So this will be all of the transports, cargo haulers, and shuttles, but also the cruisers, destroyers, and starfighters that were all a part of the Trade Federation fleets before the Confederacy of Independent Systems was formed. Remember that, as the name suggests, the Trade Federation was just a bunch of different individual merchants and shipping companies that came together to coordinate both their business efforts and to act as a lobby in the Republic. Kinda like a combination of a teachers union and OPEC, by having so many members they could get special deals, while also being important enough to the galactic economy that they would have an increasing sway on political matters, eventually to the point where they got a Senate seat. That is why the Trade Federation was able to grow to essentially have the largest navy in the galaxy until the Clone Army was unveiled. So on that note, let's start with the Auxilia-class Pursuit Destroyer. Produced by Kuat Drive Yards, this was a legitimate warship made for the Trade Defense Forces, the branch of the TF that was granted more and more power as pirate attacks became more frequent and deadly. You can see signs of the later Kuat-produced Venator, with these sloping slides coming to the strip, along with all these turbo lasers on the ventral side. This would have been used several decades before the Battle of Naboo, and was most likely one of the first to be decommissioned after that incident. From there we have the Advanced Droid Fighter, which was an upgraded version of the Vulture Droid. Though it was better in every way, the cost was also said to be significantly higher, and was most likely abandoned in favor of swarms of cheap fighters. Then we have the Advanced Project Ship, which was a predecessor to the TIE Fighter. In fact, it was made after the Scimitar, and had the general look of a TIE, but with a 20-meter wingspan instead of 7 meters. Though no official images exist, it was produced in the year 29 BBY, but again didn't fit into the droid army philosophy of countless cheap autonomous units. Then we have the C-9979 landing craft, easily one of the most useful ships in the TF. It could transport enormous amounts of cargo from the core ship and the Lucrehulk. Later it would be used to carry the land vehicles of the Federation like the MTT and AAT. And it was actually inspired by the previous TF ore barge. In that way it followed a similar path of the LH-3210s, being slowly adapted from a straight cargo ship into a more military role. After the Battle of Naboo, the Republic ordered the TF to decommission their Lucrehulks, which resulted in the core ship. But a ship that had a similar design to the 3210s was the Captor-class Heavy Munitions Cruiser. The ship was also exempt from your normal turbo laser restrictions, and could act as both a resupply ship for other Trade Federation warships, and as a carrier for squadrons of starfighters. The ESTAP was a shielded droid star bomber that was said to pack the power of a Hyena bomber while being protected by a powerful deflector shield. Then you have the Hunter-Seeker droids, which look like flying droidicas, which makes sense given that they were also produced by the Colicoid Creation Nest. Some of these would stay in use up through the Clone Wars, but were originally intended to just be automated escorts to the C-9979. These spheres would glide alongside, protecting the cargo through both space and atmosphere, and could quickly unpack and unload on pirates. The Lupus-class missile frigate played a similar role, having 4 concussion missiles for taking out pirate flagships, but also 6 anti-starfighter laser cannons to keep off any boarding parties. Some of them were able to escape the post-Battle of Naboo decommissions, with some being used to attack an acclimator in 22 BBY. And believe it or not, some Providence-class destroyers were used before the Clone Wars. Built by the Quorin, it was intended to be an improvement on the Dreadnought-class heavy cruiser. Since the Trade Federation was already allowed some cruisers and frigates that had both turbolasers and starfighter complements, it didn't really make sense to ban it just because it was a bigger ship. Of course, these got more and more heavy firepower as the years went by, until it eventually became one of the primary capital ships of the Confederacy. Then we have the Scarab-class droid starfighter, a predecessor to the Vulture. You can see how compact they could get, but though very similar in stats, when a band of pirates was able to easily blow through them, the TF lost faith and all but had them completely replaced with Vultures. Interestingly though, I just think this was bad luck for the Scarab and not a true design inferiority, so if it hadn't been for that pirate group's success, the Scarab may have been the main starfighter of the Clone Wars. Similarly, the TF droid bomber was a ship produced before they decided to just have 2 specialized ships, the Vulture as a fighter and the Hyena as a bomber. From there we have the shuttle known as the Sheathipede. This is a craft most of the later CIS leadership would trust their life to, as it was a really solid build and only required minor upgrades over its decades of production. There was the TF cargo hauler, which has no images, but notable ones like the Rim Merchant and Neem were said to be smaller versions of Lucrehulks. After the invasion of Naboo, one was seized by the Republic and used by Williff Tarkin as a command ship. The TF Cruiser has a simple name, but an exotic weapon system. Though lined with some laser cannons for taking out starfighters, its main weapons were its 12 cruise missiles, enormous bombs connected to engines that could be remotely piloted by the crew. With this accuracy, all 12 of them could be perfectly placed on an enemy ship's weak points, or guarantee a direct hit on a pirate base. TF escort cruisers were used mostly in Neimoidian space, and were described as split-ring battleships surrounded by 6 hard-cell-class interstellar transports, the latter being made for the Techno-Union. This strange combo was defeated by Thrawn in 27 BBY. Then we have the Trade Federation Freighter and Super Freighter. Both have design elements similar to the MTT, and as per the TF's MO, its cargo areas became increasingly filled with droid starfighters. The Super Freighter is equipped with deflector shields, and had these 2 laser cannon turrets. But if you want even more MTT in your design, there's the TF Troop Transport, which was essentially your favorite droid deployer with some ion engines slapped onto it. These are used during the operation on Carthak, and almost always required the escort of Scarab-class fighters. But now some even more obscure references. There's the TF Probe Droid, this unidentified mine layer, and this space station known simply as the Trade Federation ship. These different rings and platforms would make it like a massive trading port, but to me, as much as that makes sense, it doesn't really look like something from Star Wars, more like something from the Foundation series by Isaac Asimov. But that's it for all the ships and starfighters used by the Trade Federation before the Clone Wars. Definitely let me know if I missed any, and if there were some that you never heard of. Were any of these cool enough that you wish they were in the Clone Wars? Let me know in the comments down below. But most important of all, remember, beware the power creep, and the Force will be with you. Always. What's up, meta nerds? This video is all about one of the most complicated pieces of tech in all of Star Wars, S-threads. Also known as Simu tunnels, these were hyperspace tunnels that carried communications across the galaxy. They've been mentioned in a bunch of Legends novels and sourcebooks, but it was brought into the new canon via the official guide for the Solo movie and the novel Moving Target, so it's an integral part of the Star Wars universe, and it's here to stay. So, how does it work? As you can imagine, it will eventually break down into vague, hand-wavy sci-fi sounding word salads, but it surprisingly stems from a potential technology in real-world phenomenon. The problem with galactic-scale empires and trade is that you have to travel faster than the speed of light. Even going as fast as 1 billion kilometers per hour or 670 million miles per hour, it would take you 100,000 years to go from one side of the outer rim to the other. Of course, ships get around this with their hyperdrives, but communications use a much more nuanced system. It's not like you can attach your transmissions to their own hyperdrives. I can't even really conceptualize that. It would be like saying you attached a motor to a photon to make it go faster. Of course, that doesn't make sense, but ships do use a tech called a hyperwave transceiver, and there are countless transceiver buoys floating in hyperspace, creating a communications network. Although the hyperwave transceiver creates the message, it is sent out via what are called S-threads. These subatomic threads would string together ship to ship, or home to HoloNet, all sorts of communications across the galaxy. They may be called simulated because they don't exist in the real space reality, and it is based off of ideas of FTL communications that involve quantum entanglement. The real-world tech idea is that when 2 quantum particles are entangled, what happens to one affects the other, no matter how far away they are. They seem to have no connection, yet they affect each other, a phenomenon Einstein called spooky action at a distance. He wasn't on board with this idea and thought it had to be the result of other variables, as it would mean that these effects are happening quicker than the speed of light. But this is exactly what seems to be happening, and later findings have cemented this as a part of quantum mechanics. In fact, describing them as threads is a reference to a way around this problem of locality raised by this spooky action, where the particles are not on the opposite side of the universe, but connected via Einstein-Rosen bridges, aka wormholes. What some people then theorized was that you could use this to create a sort of binary code that uses the position of these particles as 0s and 1s. I can do things to a set of particles on my end and change them on your end. In other words, if mine is up, it makes yours go down. And then you have a code that can be transferred into audio or video, just like our computers do with their 1s and 0s. But there are some problems with this idea that emerge when you consider that the person on the receiving end wouldn't know if what they were looking at was the altered state or if they were the ones who were altering it. Others then theorize that you could tell by just checking if it was coherent or not. When I check it on the receiving end, if the translated 1s and 0s just made random gibberish, then you know nothing was sent. It would be like static on a radio, but if you get a complete Meta-Nerds video, then you know it has to be a transmission. That, or I guess the Force itself is sending you a message. But there are many problems with even this explanation though. If you want to look into them, check out these videos which I have linked in the description. This one has a top comment with a lot of people debating why a system like this would work, and others pointing out that it wouldn't. But though this may have been the inspiration for the S-thread, or the closest thing we may ever see in the real world, there is another problem. In the entangled scenario, both the sender and receiver need to have the particles that were entangled. So even the theoretical version of this working as a way to send binary or a sort of Morse code would only be possible for ships that had already been in contact with each other at one point before separating. Each little quantum entangled transceiver would act like a direct line to different ships. There is some evidence that this is what was happening with the New Republic in Legends. A quote from the book The New Jedi Order Star by Star reads, "The energy-absorbing effects of the nebula gas rendered the woman's voice thready and full of static. Repeat, this is the New Republic scout vessel Gabriel hailing the Millennium Falcon. Please respond on S-thread 609er." It is interesting to think that if the nebula is affecting it, either the signals do not directly connect through hyperspace but emerge around a ship and get picked up like a normal radio signal, or the S-threads do connect directly into the hyperwave transceiver through their own hyperspace wormholes, and the interference was just affecting the ship's electronics in general. But honestly, the way they switch channels like this seems more like it's just changing a frequency like a radio. So instead of each ship having a certain line to communicate through, some real hand-wavy parts are introduced with the component of a tachyon gun. From that same book, we get a line, "She immediately set work stripping the tachyon gun from a spare S-thread spinner." I like the visualization here that the device spins a thread through different planes of space-time, as tachyons are a theoretical particle that can move faster than light. So perhaps inspired by quantum entanglement, but at the end of the day, it might just operate as a wave of energy that can be transferred into data, just like a radio wave is a form of electromagnetic energy, but this tachyon wave of course moves a whole lot faster. In fact, seemingly instantaneous across the galaxy. This would make sense when we think about how S-threads were essential for keeping the HoloNet up and running, but does seem off when thinking about how S-thread booster technology works. Mentioned in the Legends book, The Essential Atlas, they are described as opening up tunnels in hyperspace where none existed before. This was incredibly expensive, and most notably used to open up the Sanctuary pipeline, a new lane the Empire made to connect to the Endor system to supply the Death Star. This was brought back into canon via the novel Moving Target. In it, Akbar says, "The Empire has used S-thread boosters to create and maintain a secret hyperspace route running from Sullust all the way to the galactic edge." He then adds that it was so expensive that it could, quote, "bankrupt whole star systems." To me, this doesn't seem like something the tachyons could do. That seems more like an expansion of the Einstein-Rosen bridges. Just as the S-threads were ridiculously tiny, subatomic-sized threads through hyperspace and real space, the S-thread boosters seem to have been able to open these threads wider, from the subatomic to miles in diameter. Perhaps this required the creation of a matrix of interconnected particles, all the threads becoming one big tunnel, but honestly, that's as deep as the lore goes. But I would love to hear all your guys' opinions on this. Like I said in the opening, I know it gets very slippery with the actual science. Definitely look forward to reading your cool ideas on how this could work, or how this just really breaks down under scrutiny. Keep in mind though, that what I'm doing is never going to fully work. You can't turn a sci fantasy into a sci-fi, and that's okay. I enjoy trying to reason how it might work in the Star Wars universe, given the lore we have to work with. I know a bunch of you do too, so definitely let me know what you guys think about the S-threads and S-thread boosters in the comments down below. The only cool behind the scenes fact is that it was first introduced in the book Star by Star, but all the other books and references are linked in the description. So that's it for one of the most complicated texts in all of Star Wars. But most important of all, remember, this kind of deep lore is essentially finding the process of squaring a circle to be fun. And the Force will be with you, always. What's up, Meta Nerds? This video is all about how BlasTech became the primary weapons manufacturer for the Clone Army and for Palpatine's Empire. When the Trade Federation put in place their blockade on Naboo, and subsequently deployed battle droids and droid starfighters to kill Gungans and the humans of that planet, most of the galaxy was watching in horror. I say most, because although this was a shock to civilians, many senators and major businesses were aware of the growing tensions between the core worlds and the Mid and Outer Rim. Many worried it would lead to a secession, which was big credits for anyone that could provide the tools of war. There were three main blaster companies in the galaxy at this time: BlasTech Industries, Mersun Munitions, and Surosub. By looking at their background and their locations, you can see why BlasTech would end up securing this incredibly lucrative Clone Army contract, as Surosub was based on Sullust, far off in the Outer Rim, While Mur-San was heavily connected to the corporate sector, another Outer Rim location, but this area of space was also independent from the Republic. If war was set to break out, you could be sure that the Outer Rim would make up the bulk of these seceding worlds, so relying on an Outer Rim manufacturer would be hazardous in either case, but especially with Mur-San, who were already under the control of a separate government, and so it would be possible that they could cripple the Republic by providing flawed weapons, or just cutting off the clones altogether at some crucial part during the war, in order to try and grab more power. Surosub produced things like the S5 Heavy Blaster Pistol and the ELG-3A, which ended up being used by the Republic's allies on Naboo, but they didn't directly score any contracts for the clone army. Mur-San would produce some unique weapons for the Republic, most notably the Z6 rotary gun, but nothing that was crucial to the war effort. BlasTech, however, was based on Coruscant, ensuring that when war broke out, they would remain loyal to the Republic, and supply lines from their facilities could be more easily secured. Though the clone army was Plagueis' idea, Palpatine and Darth Tyrannus would go about continuing this project to its completion, informing the Kaminoans along the way. Clone armor was produced in-house from Kaminoan Armorsmiths Limited, but they allocated a majority of their credits for ships and vehicles to Kuat Drive Yards and its subsidiary Rathana Heavy Engineering, while BlasTech was surprised with millions of orders for their DC-15A, DC-15S, DC-17, and even N-20 Baradium Core thermal detonators. These 4 weapons would meet troopers' roles in a variety of situations, and were the 4 most crucial weapons for any army. The Z6 was powerful, but losing it if Mur-San was captured by the CIS would not cripple the clone troopers. Going with BlasTech ensured that your infantry rifle, carbine, sidearm, and explosives were all from the most secure of your weapons manufacturing options. With the Republic's victory in the Clone Wars, BlasTech had helped give rise to the Empire, which almost cost them their company, with Palpatine's demands that they only sell weapons exclusively to the Imperial military. To show you just how powerful these weapon manufacturers were, how much influence they still wielded even under an Emperor, BlasTech was able to refuse this exclusivity deal. They made the new main blaster of the armed forces, replacing the DC-15 with the E-11, while still being able to sell arms to civilians, which of course ended up supplying the rebellion with things like the DH-17 and the DL-44. This allowed the blaster manufacturer that dated back all the way to the Old Republic era to outlive the latest in a series of tyrants and keep selling arms into the New Republic era. And even though the New Republic's laws forbid the sales of arms to unrecognized governments, they were able to supply the First Order with their F-11D by creating the merger company San Blas with their once rivals Mur-San Munitions, creating a company that on paper was completely separate and which operated in the unknown regions of space. So that's it for the story of how BlasTech became the main weapons provider for the Galactic Republic and Palpatine's Empire. But most important of all, remember, you can always bet on BlasTech, and the Force will be with you, always. What's up, Meta Nerds? This video is going to answer the question, how many seats are in the Republic Senate? It gets a bit complicated, but let's start by just figuring out how many of these pods are in the Senate Rotunda. The canon reference book Ultimate Star Wars says, quote, "The huge open area is lined with 1,024 pods, arrayed in concentric circles, each pod housing a delegation from an important planet, sector, or political body." But there isn't just 1,024 senators. In fact, right away we see how convoluted this gets, starting with the very term senator. Unlike a lot of politics from Earth, the terms representatives and senator seem to be used interchangeably. It isn't two different positions with different scope or voting power. Then there was royalty, like the Queen of Naboo, and important groups that were granted representation, like the Trade Federation. We saw that in a single pod representing Naboo, we have the Senator Palpatine and Queen Amidala. And then they fight with a pod that isn't representing a planet or sector, but what is essentially a large union. The Trade Federation has representatives due to their interests affecting millions, if not billions, of employees. A concession that was made by the Republic because it didn't make sense that inconsequential worlds could use voting power to cripple the Trade Federation, which kept wealth flowing across countless important worlds. So the TF would have fit into that last category, political body. But really, besides those handful of exceptions, it was mostly based off of star systems and sectors. In the Legends book, The Essential Atlas, sectors were defined as having a max of 50 inhabited star systems. You can see that there are a ton of sectors even in the outer and mid rims, which are the least densely populated areas. As you move towards the core, you would expect the sectors to get much smaller in their map size, since its denser population means that you hit the 50 system max a lot quicker. So I counted around 176 sectors in the outer rim, and because each sector from the mid into the deep core gets smaller but more dense, let's say that those two factors even each other out, and on average each area has 176 sectors. This gives us 1,232 sectors, which is more than our pod count at 1,024. But our sector number was just an estimate. It's close enough to think that the true sector count was just under 1,024, leaving room for those handful of exceptions like the Trade Federation. But that raises some funny questions. What happens if you get new sectors? Where do their pods go? It looks pretty cramped in that building. We know that there's multiple galaxies in the Star Wars universe, and in Legends, some of those places are very populated. Also, how does a sector decide how they are going to vote? For example, Naboo is in the Chamel sector, a sector that has 36 star systems. Palpatine was just called the Senator from Naboo, partly because he was born there, but also because Naboo was the most prominent of the Chamel star systems. But then the Queen from Naboo was able to call a vote of no confidence on the Supreme Chancellor. And she doesn't even represent everyone on just her planet. Does the King of the Gungans have this power?
Be gone with him!
How about some random ruler for one of the countless other inhabited worlds in just this one sector? And just think about multiplying that madness by 1,000. So you can see why this is confusing, but we can't forget about the delegation of 2,000. These were 2,000 senators who all joined together to petition the Chancellor's abuse of emergency powers during the Clone Wars. Keep in mind, this was at a time when Palpatine's ratings were very high. In fact, it is because so many approved of his rule that he was able to become Emperor and still receive thunderous applause. So the 2,000 senators must have been a minority. Not so small that they didn't think they would have an impact, but not even close to half. This is one of the factors that leads people to think that perhaps there were around 10,000 individuals with voting power, be they senators, representatives, royalty, or just some large organizations. At around 8 people a pod, I guess this is possible, but I think it's simpler and just worked a lot like voting in most democracies. If 100% of the senators actually turned out to vote, they would have to hold multiple Senate sessions. You would need to have around 10 separate sessions in order to have them all there in person. But this isn't what we see in the films. Things are solved as if the session that we are seeing is the whole process. To me, this just means that while some areas might technically have the power to vote, they just choose not to. Like many people, they may just see their contribution as meaningless, that it's all rigged and the Republic just does what it wants. That, or only the important sectors have pods, and everyone else is just voting remotely. This way, everyone is still represented, and the politicians that want to be seen and grab holocam time can give their dramatic speeches in this powerful Senate rotunda. So perhaps this building is mostly just for show, a sort of political theater, and most of the actual vote casting is done remotely. Certainly a technological solution that would be more fitting of a galaxy-spanning civilization, with constituents of hundreds of different species. What do you think of all this? Are there any other sources you know that can help pin down the exact number of senators? What do you think about the multiple Senate sessions idea? Or the remote voting option? And do you think the Republic became so diffused and inept that many sectors of the galaxy just ignored the Republic and did their own thing, breaking Republic law but also not voting, all without actually seceding? But most important of all, remember, at least they made room for the ET delegation. And the Force will be with you, always. What's up, Meta Nerds? This video is going to answer 2 very important questions. Why did Palpatine feel the need to rename the Republic as an empire? And if he did that, why keep the Imperial Senate? We'll answer both in this video since the reasoning for them are intertwined. The question comes from the idea that since Palpatine already had absolute power over the Republic via the emergency powers, why was there a need to change the title? This surely would just alarm everyone, which would just make rebellion more likely. Why not just leave it as a republic in name, while continuing to act like a dictator? But also, if you are going to dismantle the Republic and rule as an emperor, then why leave in place the Senate? It was now just an obsolete branch of the government, so why would you want an imperial version? What does an imperial Senate even do if you're an absolute ruler? Well, let's address all of this in order, starting with the emergency powers. Remember, they were just that, powers granted because of an emergency. With the Clone Wars at an end, there was no emergency, and remember what Palpatine said that fateful day in the Senate Rotunda.
The power you give me, I will lay down when this crisis has abated.
So after a while, people will start looking around saying, okay buddy, I think it's about time you lay down those powers, and we continue on with our normal Supreme Chancellor elections. By essentially creating a second emergency, which was the Jedi's treasonous attempt to try and take control of the Republic, he made the galactic population think that this whole system was just too fragile and in need of reworking. So this was the only time that such a drastic transition could work. That brings us to the question, why did he need to change the name? Well, a simple reason is that if you're going to be a dictator over distant areas, by definition you're an emperor, and so you have to call it an empire. But to that point, it wasn't just a name change. Two very important new governmental elements were introduced: sector governors and the Imperial Ruling Council. This was a natural transition out of the Clone Wars, which just goes to show the level of genius that Palpatine had, that every aspect of his plan served so many different functions. Check out this Legends map of how the Republic split the galaxy up into sectors during the war, a concept that has been retained in canon. The sector armies were responsible for keeping the peace in these regions, and reporting back to a war council which included Palpatine and top Jedi. Now under Imperial rule, these sectors would be led by MOFs, and report to the Emperor and his Imperial Ruling Council. Those are all the weirdos you see hanging around Sheev. They were all a bunch of yes-men, so essentially, Republic veterans that were extremely loyal to the Emperor were promoted to the position of MOF, and everyone in the council just went along with Palpatine's decisions. During the time of the Republic, senators were loyal to their system. It was much more local. The Alderaan system, for example, would have Bail Organa to represent them, who of course had deep ties to the planet of Alderaan. With MOFs covering these vast areas of space, their loyalty was to no individual planet or system, but to the man that gave them this enormous power, the Emperor. Again, the Clone Wars was necessary to make this palatable by the public, as it was seen that Palpatine led the Republic to victory against the enormously powerful CIS, while simultaneously fighting off a coup by the Jedi Order. And the Separatists just so happened to be led by an ex-Jedi, so maybe there was even some evil conspiracy at work here, but the one thing that was simple to understand was that Palpatine was the man who knew how to keep peace. So let's just leave that whole system in place. Really, if you think about it, the only thing that would have been outrageous would have been if he sent all the senators home on that same day. This really might have incited an alliance of different systems to oppose him. A sort of second separatist movement just hours later, and keep in mind that would be a faction that Palpatine wouldn't secretly be controlling. By leaving the Senate in place for around 20 years, the planet still had their normal elections to put in place new senators. They still had the illusion of an impact on government. Because there are so many competing interests in the Senate, no matter which way the Emperor chose, he would end up doing what many senators wanted. From the point of view of the public, and probably even a lot of senators, laws were getting passed for and against their interests at the same ratio as before. So though technically a dictator, they still felt like they were being heard. 2 decades of this meant roughly a whole generation grew up with this system as normal, which would help the next part of his plan go smoothly. The final piece of Sidious's grand plan really is the Death Star, because as soon as that becomes fully operational, the Imperial Senate is disbanded. MOFs aren't loyal to individual planets, and now if any planet gets out of line, they can be easily and completely destroyed. Or as Tarkin explains it,
The Imperial Senate will no longer be of any concern to us.
How will the Emperor maintain control without the bureaucracy?
The regional governors now have direct control over their territories. Fear will keep the local systems in line. Fear of this battle station.
to prove this Tarkin doctrine, they would take the most vocal of dissenters and turn this superweapon on Alderaan. Bail Organa had been one of the leading voices of dissent, even being a co-creator of the Delegation of 2000 during the Clone Wars, which sought to rein in those emergency powers. And it didn't help that their senator and Princess Leia was constantly being linked back to rebel cells. Of course, we know how this plan backfired, but hopefully I was able to lay out how it all made sense. If you have any other questions, be sure to put them down in the description. But I also have a couple questions for you guys. Do you think a second separatist movement might have formed if he immediately disbanded the Senate? And where do you think the Death Star would have struck after Alderaan? The Delegation of 2000 was co-founded by Mon Mothma of Chandrila, who was also leading the Rebel Alliance by then, so I could definitely see this place turning into dust. Padme became a thorn in his side, and Naboo was always pacifist, so do you think Big Palpy would have turned the super laser on his own homeworld? Definitely let me know in the comments down below. But most important of all, Remember, if good people can't provide security, bad people will, and the Force will be with you, always. Say what you will, but Big Palpy was one of the most creative beings in the galaxy. What's up, meta nerds? This video will cover everything we know about one of Sidious's most secret programs. This whole plot started with the theft of a very unique holocron. This was one of the most important devices in the Jedi library, holding the names of thousands of Force-sensitive children that were to be contacted and brought into the Jedi Order. They had already been discovered by the Jedi, as we can see with this Rodian mother, remarking that she had already been told by the Jedi that they would come back for her son sometime in the future.
Master Ropal said the day would come for him to go to the temple, but not for some time.
He looks like he's only about a year old and is thus too young to be a youngling. Darth Sidious tasked Cad Bane with kidnapping these children so that he could use them as test subjects.
I need test subjects.
Listen to what the droid says about this procedure.
Subjects of this age rarely survive the slave conditioning procedure.
The reason why it's called slave conditioning is explained by what Palpatine says next.
I foresee an army of Force-talented spies in my service, trained in the dark side to peer into every corner of the galaxy from afar.
So there's a lot there to unpack, and our first clue is actually in the same episode. In order to identify the children that were being targeted, Yoda, Mace, Obi, and Anakin all enter into a deep joint meditation. Side note here, but it's really cool to see how powerful Yoda is, that he's the one processing the other's visions.
The Gungan child was screaming.
The future, you see.
Even Mace needing Yoda to explain the vision to him.
Nautilins. Glee Ansem?
Glee Ansem. I see not.
You are certain there is no child on Glee Ansem?
Into the shadow of the dark side. Taken, the child was. Sure.
It appears that just like how the Jedi were able to see through the eyes of these other Force sensitives, Palpatine planned on using them as sorts of organic listening posts, spreading them across the galaxy and actually being medically altered to deny them their own free will. This is really one of the most intricate and horrifying plots in all of Star Wars. This slave conditioning would make them like Force-sensitive husks, where they would pick up on the disturbances in the Force, and then their minds could be searched by Sidious, thus allowing him to track down the newly detected Force-sensitive. A perfect way to find his own younglings, and for finding any survivors of Order 66. For some reason, it really reminds me of Stalkers from Half-Life 2, that you could dramatically alter their brains, throw them in a life-sustaining chamber, and then just set them up in hidden locations across the galaxy, acting as Force radio towers. Now, this particular experimentation site on Mustafar was discovered by the Jedi, but everything points to Palpatine starting this scheme back up. Now, both canon and legends tell us that Padawans were collected after Order 66, as the galaxy was full of way more than just those killed at the temple. Some of these would be developed into the Inquisitors, and these dark side users would go about searching the galaxy for evidence of other Force sensitives. The Ahsoka book gives a really great insight into the daily activities and goals of an Inquisitor. At first we hear how monotonous it is, quote,
"He was reduced to this, sitting on a backwater planet, watching an unruly mob of children until one of them exhibited Force sensitivity that he or she may not actually possess."
But moments later, we see an Imperial make a broadcast to units in the area, stating that a potential Padawan survivor had been detected, and the excitement begins. And more to our main question, he states,
"This was much better than looking for a child. A child was to be captured and taken for experimentation and corruption. A Jedi, even a lowly Padawan, he could kill."
So the Inquisitor was excited to be able to hunt and kill a Jedi, but searching for a child is more of a long, drawn-out process, and that he has to bring it in alive. He explicitly calls it experimentation, just as Sidious referred to it in the Clone Wars, and that allows the corruption. And since we know that Palpatine is coming back in some capacity, it is possible that these slave mind husks that were stored as Force radio towers across the galaxy helped him to hold on to power all these years later. It definitely was one of the most secretive projects Palpatine ever started, but I do want to also bring up a point that is a major spoiler for the novel Thrawn Alliances. In it, we learn that the Chiss kept a huge secret, that they used Force-sensitive children to navigate through wild space, without using the technology of traditional routes, like hyperspace beacons used by the rest of the galaxy. Also in the Aftermath trilogy, Palpatine was consumed with observing a dark side entity outside of the galaxy, via the mysterious ancient tech of the so-called observatories. So given that tech, and given the fact that this program was definitely restarted with the help of the Inquisitors, and seeing that the Chiss even used Force-sensitive to navigate space, you can see how the corruption of Force-sensitive children was an essential part of Sidious's rule over the galaxy, and they've likely been collecting data for the Dark Lord all these decades later. But what do you think of all this? Do you hope this gets addressed in the next season of The Clone Wars, or in The Mandalorian, or even in the major films? Definitely let me know in the comments down below. But most important of all, remember, in a galaxy far, far away, your childhood could have been a lot worse, and the Force will be with you. Always. What's up, Meta Nerds? This video is all about the A6 Interceptor, used by the Jedi and Republic Judicial Forces before the Clone Wars. It was built by Kuat Drive Yards, and was the predecessor of the A9 Interceptor. Kuat also produced the Eta II Actis Interceptor, which was similar in both size and function. In a way, the A6 was the Eta II of a previous era, being introduced some decades before 44 BBY. But it follows a millennia-long tradition of quick, small, single-pilot starfighters used by the Republic, with ships like the Auric-class dating back thousands of years to the time of the Old Republic. Its only weaponry is listed as 3 laser cannons, no torpedoes or missiles, but it did have its own hyperdrive. During the events that would come to be known as the Stark Hyperspace War, many A6 interceptors were escorting the fleet of Republic Outland security forces. This fleet was led by Ranulph Tarkin, who was a cousin to Williff Tarkin on his father's side. But also very interesting about this ship is that it seems to have carried a sort of cloaking device. When the fleet was shot down over Troikan, some of Stark's fighters harassed the Republic cruisers as they were making a crash landing. The arrival of a squadron of A6 shocks the pilot, who doesn't pick any of them up on his scanners. Even more interesting is that Command and the SCC capital ships insist that there are no fighters showing up on their scanners either. To avoid the more sophisticated scanners of these larger ships, this kind of cloaking technology would have made the price very high. But of course, the Republic can certainly afford it, and as crazy as this sounds, it was likely more than 300,000 credits, since it would have had more tech than the later Eta II. A ship that's a pretty good comparison, because like I said, they were both produced by Kuat, and they are also nearly the same size. At 6 meters or 20 feet long, it was less than half the length of an X-Wing, and 2/3 an A-Wing. Compared to a jet interceptor used by the United States, the Corvair F-106 Delta Dart was 3.5 times this pre-Clone Wars interceptor. Back over to Troikan, we find that Qui-Gon and a Padawan Kenobi were able to sneak onto Stark's flagship and secure a patch for a virus that was preventing the Republic ships from using their hyperdrives accurately. With this signal broadcasted, the Trade Federation carrier ships, the Captor-class, emerged right over the enemy fleet. Led by starfighter enthusiast and perhaps the best pilot until Anakin, Saesee led red and blue squadrons of A6 interceptors, while other A6 squadrons peeled off to light up the rest of Stark's fleet. This would result in an impressive Republic victory, with the A6s lasting from long before the 40s BBY up until the Clone Wars. But it wouldn't be until 9 ABY that its successor came along. The A9 Vigilance was produced by the remnant of the Galactic Empire a whole 5 years after the Battle of Endor, and it was actually made in response to the increasingly devastating use of A-Wings by the New Republic. So that's it for its history, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind-the-scenes stuff. It was first introduced in the book The School of Fear of the Jedi Quest Jr. novel series, but it was first shown in the comic Star Wars 39, with additional facts coming from the Essential Guide to Warfare. But that's it for the A6 Interceptor. But most important of all, remember, not all Jedi hate flying, and the Force will be with you. Always. What's up, Meta Nerds? This video is all about the Trade Federation's battle droid before the B1s, the HK-B3 Hunter Killer Droid. That name probably gets your attention, as the HK series of assassin droids gave the galaxy the most terrifying and humorous droid of all, HK-47.
That is a very clever turn of phrase, Master. Your brain is very un-meatbag-like.
That was nearly 4,000 years before the HK-B3, but various descendants of the HK had been holding up the mantle for years. The original models were built by Zerka Corporation, but over all that time, the ability to produce something as deadly as this line of droids had disseminated across the galaxy to the point that many companies were able to produce droids of this quality. The HK-B3 was produced by Bactoid Combat Automata, the same company that would later make most of the Trade Federation's security droids. It is classified as a 4th degree droid, which means they were purposely made for combat. They are about the same height as a B1 at around 1.93 meters or 6 feet 4 inches, somewhere between a Keldor's height and a Wookiee. What's really interesting is that their armor is made of quadanium steel, the same material used on the heavy turbo lasers found on the Death Stars. This was more powerful than the B1s, and perhaps even the B2, which meant this thing wasn't going down with a single blaster bolt. It is interesting to wonder if a slug rifle would have been better for targets like this. But of course, an ion weapon would just short-circuit a droid, and when it came to the Jedi, well, their lightsabers did what lightsabers do. Unless you're a CB3 Cortosis droid, can't forget about the droid that nearly undermined Sidious's plans. Another interesting feature were these modular arms. Your standard unit could handle blasters like a fleshy organic, but the arms could be easily swapped out for these built-in blasters that synchronized with the targeting computers for incredible accuracy. All of the Tabana gas required would be kept in packs around the beltline. This triple laser arm was preferred for security patrols, and it was this scope that translated additional data to the processors in its rectangular head. But like most Trade Federation droids up to the Battle of Naboo, these too relied on a central control computer. By looking at the sensor pack of both the HK-B3 and B1, you can see how much more compact the latter is. And remember, after a slave boy from Tatooine showed just how vulnerable it is to have your army rely on these control computers, all the battle droids from then on out could operate independently with their own basic AIs. The cost of one of the hunter killers was 19,130 credits brand new, which is around 10 times the cost of a B1, but less than a droideka. Now as for their history, we see them in action during the Stark Hyperspace War of 44 BBY. On the planet Troikan, Jedi were handling negotiations between the Trade Federation Minister Newt Gunray and Stark himself. When the Pirate Lord revealed his intentions to kill the Republic's representatives, Gunray pressed a button on his mechano chair that opened up commands to the droid bodyguards. The problem was, he said kill them all, so these 4 droids opened up on everyone in the room. Valorum was in there too, but luckily for the Republic, his Jedi bodyguards were able to deflect the bolts coming in from both the droids and Stark's fighters. But this was a rather small area, and in the firefight, Wookiee Jedi Master Tyvaka was cut down. A split second later, Qui-Gon would slice through the droids with a single slash. Happening concurrent to all this, a young Quinlan Vos and his master Thulm were investigating the suspicious circumstances of a back-to-plant explosion. Here they are ambushed by an HK-B3 with his modified triple blaster arm. The bolts occupied the 2 Jedi for a while, but by calling on the Force, their speed and agility was able to outmaneuver the HK, with the 2 Jedi closing in for a coordinated attack. Though they survived unscathed, you can see Quinlan respects this droid's ability, saying if a hunter-killer droid is there, quote, someone is serious about protecting the secrets of this place. That is the last time we see this droid in action, but throughout the Clone Wars there were remote locations in the galaxy that were said to be still patrolled by these old Trade Federation units. Even in these obscure areas, the HK-B3 struck fear into those that dared to trespass on Separatist property. So that's it for its history, but you definitely want to hear its cool facts and behind-the-scenes stuff. It was first introduced in the comic Star Wars 36, and was named in the Scavenger's Guide to Droids, where it also got its price. In different artwork, there are some variations on the photoreceptors, with these red lines or 2 eye-like receptors. And definitely let me know what you guys think about this droid. Do you wish we could have seen more of it in the Clone Wars? And do you like its design? Not sure why, but to me it looks like a mix of a B1 and Chappie on steroids. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. But that's it for the Trade Federation's security droid before the B1. But most important of all, remember, the HK legacy will never die, and the Force will be with you. Always. What's up, Meta-Nerds? This video is all about a Trade Federation cruiser that once helped the Jedi and carried a squadron of their A6 interceptors. Though the bridge and look of the sides is similar to the Lucrehulk, it was not produced by Horish Kessel Drive, but instead by Kuat Drive Yards. KDY would later make nearly all of the Republic's war vessels, directly producing things like the Venator and Arquitens, but also the Juggernaut and AT-TE through their subsidiary Rathana Heavy Engineering. But nearly 200 years before the Clone Wars, the Trade Defense Force purchased several of these carriers along with Munifex-class cruisers. They were deployed to the Rasik sector to confront pirates that had been harassing a system that had just entered into the Trade Federation. This confrontation would foreshadow the Stark Hyperspace War of 44 BBY. The Stark Commercial Combine was a band of smugglers, pirates, mercenaries, bounty hunters, and assassins who all worked together to challenge the Trade Federation. Their leader took advantage of a crisis at a Bacta facility to launch his band into galactic infamy. A major explosion at the galaxy's primary Bacta production plant dramatically reduced the supply of the healing blue liquid that was vital to so many medical procedures. Core worlds consolidated all their bacta and tried to buy up reserves, but most Outer Rim worlds couldn't afford it at the new high prices. The fleets of the SCC would raid bacta shipments meant for the core, and sell them throughout the Outer Rim at prices that were lower than anyone else could. Because the Trade Federation had the largest trade network across the galaxy, it was their Captor-class ships that were often transporting the blue gold. Its internal areas in these arms could be filled with cargo, but it would increasingly be filled with fighters and droids made for the Trade Defense Force. When attacked, these droid fighters could rapidly deploy from this central hangar, but the Federation just wasn't powerful enough at this time to repel a coordinated attack by a gang of hardened criminals. That is why the Republic had to get involved, as the TF demanded that either the Jedi and Judicial forces destroy the Stark Commercial Combine, or they would be forced to stop trade and let the TDF become a fully operational military. To prevent this, the Republic dedicated several corvettes and fighters, but the real blow to Stark's operation came when the Trade Federation allowed the use of several captors to launch a surprise attack. Dozens of A6 interceptors that had both Republic pilots and Jedi were deployed at a stunning speed from the Trade Federation's carrier. So just 8 years before the blockade over Naboo, the Federation and Jedi were working as close allies. But this ship's relationship with the Republic would actually continue up through 29 BBY, when Wraith Sienar was assigned one by will of Tarkin. The ship was named the Admiral Corvin, and was considered old by this time, but with its complement, we can get a rough estimate of the Captor's size. During a mission to Zonama Sekot, this ship contained 30 Vulture droids, 3,000 B-1 battle droids, an unknown amount of E-5 battle droids, 100 human troops, and 3 C-9979 landing craft. Even if we ignore the space the droids would have taken up, as they could be densely packed on racks, and the Vultures could probably hang from the ceiling like they did in the Lucrehulk, just the landing craft would have required this hangar to be around 400 meters wide. The problem with that is that we get insane dimensions for this thing, like 3,200 meters long and 1,800 meters wide, which would make it about twice the dimensions of the Imperial Star Destroyer. Instead, I think we just have to assume that the C-9979 wasn't fully assembled inside of this ship, like with what we see in the core ship's cross-section. If we look at this lineup, I believe we get a much more reasonable reference. We would get a length of 544.5 meters or 1,786 feet, which was about 2/3 a Munificent and about 1/3 an Imperial Star Destroyer. And at a width of 340 meters or 1,116 feet, it was more than twice the width of the Requisite-class light destroyer. While at a height of 276 meters or 906 feet, it was actually taller than the Venator. If it were to show up here on Earth, it would be about 1.5 times the length of the Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, about half the height of the One World Trade Center building, and 1.5 times the width of the Great Pyramid. So you can see that even with these smaller dimensions, it is easy to picture all of these droids and ships fitting into this thing, as long as the landing craft had a novel way of leaving the hangar. After this ship's use by Wraith Sienar, we don't ever again hear of its use by either the Republic or the Trade Federation. I would assume this is because the CIS had a bunch of other good carriers by this time, and the Captor-class had been around for about 200 years by the time of the Clone Wars. So that's it for its history, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. The ship's first appearance is in the comic Star Wars Republic 36, and the Sienar story comes from the novel Rogue Planet. Additional details come from the Essential Guide to Warfare, which first named it as the Heavy Munitions Carrier. There are mods for Empire at War that feature a similar design, with artists that I have linked to in the description. Also, I found this ship in the comic, which looks like it was definitely designed similar to the Captor, but it has this kind of C-70 looking bridge and more engines. I don't know what it is, but definitely let me know if you do in the comments down below. The closest thing I have is that Tarkin once had a former Trade Federation ship known as the Rim Merchant Inim, which was said to be a smaller cousin of the Lucrehulk. Then there's also this diplomatic cruiser that has these extra escape pods, so I could use some help identifying this one too. But that's it for the Captor-class. But most important of all, remember, beware the Trade Federation haulers bearing Jedi interceptors, and the Force will be with you, always. What's up, meta nerds? This video is all about one of the most powerful ships in the Trade Defense Force, the Munifex-class light cruiser. It was known colloquially as the Class 1000, since the very first order placed by the defense wing of the Trade Federation was for 1,000 of these well-equipped light cruisers. It is unclear the exact year that it was introduced, but like the Captor-class droid carrier also used by the TDF, the Munifex-class was produced by Kuat Drive Yards. Kuat would make a lot of ships for the Trade Federation, and almost certainly would have been in the CIS if it wasn't for the machinations of Darth Sidious. If you want to learn more about how he secured Kuat for the Republic, be sure to check out our video on that story. Because of course, Kuat knew how to make great ships, just ask the pirates of the Rasik sector. When a local transport business decided to join the Galactic Federation of other trade businesses, the Defense Force showed up and put a violent end to piracy in this sector. A flotilla which included a Captor-class heavy munitions cruiser and 2 Munifex-class cruisers were able to secure a total victory over the pirate gangs in the year 214 BBY. This impressive display of power would foreshadow the military might of the CIS during the Clone Wars. So let's take a look at just how powerful this thing was. Starting off with its size, at 300 meters or 984 feet, it was twice the length of the CR-90 and about 2 X-wings shorter than the Arquidens. Being 196 meters or 643 feet tall, it was almost 3 times the height of the Arquidens and a shocking 6 times the CR-90. And at what seems to be around 85 meters or 279 feet wide, it was about twice the CR-90 and about half the Arquidens. If it was here on Earth, it would be about 47 meters longer than the Yamato, 2/3 the height of the Eiffel Tower, and nearly 2 football fields wide. Now in order for all that to mean anything, we need to look at the armament and complement. The Munifex was one of the most firepower dense ships ever made, with 28 turbo lasers and 12 ion cannons. This combination makes it an incredible capital ship killer. The MC-30C frigate, a ship that we previously dubbed a capital ship killer, was about twice the Munifex's length and only had 16 turbo lasers. The MC-30C was admittedly more well-rounded, with 2 heavy proton torpedo launchers to finish off an enemy capital ship once their shields went down, along with 16 twin laser cannons and 6 cluster bomb launchers to act as a defense from starfighters and bombers. But I always love to see a ship with great specialization, and just focusing on quickly disabling shields with the ion cannons, and then following up with a barrage from 28 turbo lasers is a strategy that you just have to respect. It also helps with logistics, as the ion and turbo lasers all just draw from the same Tabana gas. Torpedoes, missiles, and bombs are awesome, but I feel like it would be much easier to keep ships like the Munifex always at full power, which is similar to the idea behind the Carrack-class. The lack of defense from starfighters might be worrisome, but remember that it was intended to be paired with the Captor-class carrier, a carrier that could house dozens, if not hundreds of small droid starfighters. So with this combo, we really see the Separatist ability to have specialized units being foreshadowed as well. And it is important to note that later when the Empire deployed them, they were able to pack in a squadron of TIE fighters. To run it all, it required a crew of 660, which included 80 gunners. But it could also transport 200 troops and 500 metric tons of cargo, a weight equal to 614 dewbacks. I would assume that some of these troops and cargo areas were modified to make room for the TIE fighters. To make it across the galaxy, it had a Class 2 hyperdrive, and it even had a backup Class 12, which is all on par with this kind of vehicle. But despite these abilities, it had been long abandoned by the Trade Federation for military purposes by the time of the Clone Wars. And though the Empire did scoop up all that were still operational, they just relegated them to low-priority sectors. One such vessel was the Intrepid, which guarded a remote asteroid prison facility in the Minos cluster. But outside of that, it seems this remarkable ship faded into obscurity. So that's it for its history, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind-the-scenes stuff. It was first introduced in the RPG book Galaxy Guide 6, Tramp Freighters, and was named the Munifex-class light cruiser in the Essential Guide to Warfare, where it also got its Trade Federation backstory. And Munifex is a Roman word and name for militias that were non-specialized and just did low-priority tasks, exactly what the Empire used them for. So that's it for the Munifex-class light cruiser. But most important of all, remember, if you hate pirates, just pay your Trade Federation membership dues, and the Force will be with you, always. The Area 51 raid was a dud, so let's go check out NIHQ. What's up, meta nerds? This video is going to be a breakdown of the Naval Intelligence headquarters. There will be some major spoilers for one of the most important arcs in the Clone Wars TV show, coming from Season 5, Episodes 18 through 20. I don't want to ruin that for you, so if you haven't seen it, just go ahead and give this video a like before changing it, and we'll see you back here later. For everyone else, you know that there's a ton of small details that are shown in a split second, so we'll go over all those, as well as the base's origins, its purpose, and information from canon novels that have expanded on it. Let's just start with its location. It is on a part of Coruscant's upper level that is often referred to as Core Square. Just as Coruscant itself is the core of all of the galaxy's happenings, the Federal District is the core of Coruscant. There you'll find 500 Republica, the Compnor arcology that contained the ISB, the Senate building and offices, as well as the Jedi Temple. Just about all the major locations on Coruscant are in this district, and fittingly so is the headquarters of the Republic military. An HQ that was designed by a man of the Republic Corps of Engineers known as Orson Krennic. His career started as an architect, but his political and military savvy kept getting him more and more government contracts. And it was in these circles that he would become reunited with a friend that he made in his teen years as a part of the Galactic Republic's future program. Galen Erso was dedicated to Kyber crystal research, and Krennic used his pull to secure Erso a professorship at the Institute of Applied Science. The Death Star construction would be entrusted to Krennic, partly due to his success at engineering facilities like the Naval Intelligence headquarters. The building itself was made of layers of hardened durasteel and permacrete. Being a permanent planet-side structure, it was way stronger than the hull of any Star Destroyer. It was then protected by a series of deflector shields, with 2 large projectors located right on the main building. But it is likely that there are several other generators and deflectors that are spread out across the facility. This shielded area was said to extend far above NIHQ, allowing for a safe scrambling of starfighters and positioning of capital ships. Because surrounding Naval Intelligence was an enormous airfield and refueling depot. Some of these tubes are for drainage and waste removal that would be channeled out towards a large pit that leads down to the lower levels, but many of these structures are refueling everything from Juggernaut tanks to LAAT gunships, starfighters like ARC-170s and Y-Wings, but also C-70s, acclimators, and venators. In the event of an attack, these most likely made up a defense fleet that was dedicated to just this facility, as the Coruscant defense fleet is much larger. When foes can pop out of hyperspace at any moment, having your most important military base surrounded by all this force is a good call. Then, just for good measure, the main building has these rapid repeating heavy turbolaser turrets. They're about the size of the turbolasers seen on the Venator, but fire much faster, perhaps an advantage of having it on-world, where it can be supported by the entire base. And or these were just the best thing credits could buy, saved for the HQ, but not cost-effective to put on each of the Republic's main Star Destroyers. Out in this plaza, we can see the first battle memorial. This enormous slab of rock was carved out of a Geonosian spire, and lists the designations of the thousands of clones lost during the opening battle of the Clone Wars. This large writing in the center spells out Battle of Geonosis, and around this area are obelisks that have giant carvings of clone troopers on each side. Then you see the flags bearing the colors and galactic roundel that signified the Republic for thousands of years. And one of the most important rooms in there was the Strategic Planning Amphitheater, a location that was holding weekly top-secret meetings by the year 21 BBY, and it is where Krennic, among others, would discuss the threat of a separatist superweapon, the Mobile Battle Station. And it was in this room that the Republic decided to build their own mobile battle station from this captured intel. Because of this location's importance, it was said to make up part of the Supreme Triangle, connecting the Imperial Palace, which was the former Jedi Temple, and the Compnor Arcology, which was a combination of spy agency and propaganda department during the Imperial era. But since this area was so well defended, it was also chosen to house the galaxy's highest level prisoners of war. The Republic Judiciary Central Detention Center had some of the toughest security in the galaxy. Every corner is said to have microphones and micro cameras. Each hallway is either lined with a series of double ray shielded segments, or contains a series of blast doors. Both excellent ways to keep an invading CIS force out, or prisoners in. Now remember, the leader of the CIS was himself a former Jedi, and this may be in part why we see that Ahsoka, and even the famed General Anakin, have no sway over the clones that run this facility.
Let me in.
It is based on Coruscant, so the shock troopers, aka the Coruscant Guard, would have likely been chosen anyways. But since these clones are not used in battle, not loyal to Jedi generals, they have a more deeper connection to the military officials of the Republic. They answer directly to Tarkin, not to those who rely on their hokey religion and ancient weapons. We can see that all visitors must pass through this intake area, which has guards safely behind transparasteel. A full body scan is performed, and even these notable Jedi are not trusted with their weapons, or even their communication devices. Just think about how the Jedi and their lightsaber are allowed to go just about anywhere. The Senate floor, the Supreme Chancellor's office, everywhere but this maximum security prison. This location held high-profile prisoners like Worm Loathsome, leader of the Retail Caucus, and who was responsible for the capture of Christophsis. There was an unidentified T-Series droid, but would have likely have been a high-ranking CIS general like Kalani. There was Wat Tambor, who was the leader of the Techno Union and executive at Bactoid Armor Workshop, and even Poggle the Lesser, overseer of the Bactoid facilities and public leader of the Geonosians, second only to Queen Karina the Great. There are no accounts of how Wat Tambor escaped, but Poggle escaped while being used by Krennic to lead the Geonosian construction of the Death Star. In the unlikely event that anyone escaped from the prison, there are also advanced recon forces, or ARF troopers, that would utilize massifs to track the prisoner's scent. Cool side note, but the massifs are native to Geonosis. And then there were all those LAATs equipped with searchlights that could be quickly scrambled when an alarm was sounded. For those accused of treason, as well as for secret trials kept out of the public eye, this location also housed the Military Tribunal courtroom. Here, Jedi and military officials could weigh in on the fate of those that were claimed to have betrayed the Galactic Republic. Tarkin may have been feeling triumphant when he asked that Ahsoka be put to death, but 5 years later on this same compound, a group of rebels would successfully hijack then Moff Williff Tarkin's personal Corvette, the Carrion Spike, while he was attending a meeting at this very compound. Pretty embarrassing too, because it included the Joint Chiefs, leaders of the Compnor, and even Emperor Palpatine. So that's it for our tour of this top-secret Republic facility. And the only behind-the-scenes fact is that the writers intended this arc to show the Jedi's loss of power to the government, eventually foreshadowing the Empire. We see the clones listening to Tarkin, not Jedi, and it shows that the military could have put a Jedi to death, not allowing the Jedi Order to handle their fallen Jedi as they saw fit. The story of Krennic comes from the novel Catalyst, which fans of the channel will know is one of my favorite new canon books. And the Tarkin details come from the Tarkin novel, which is also canon, and highly acclaimed as well. But most important of all, remember, Tarkin stealing the Death Star project from Krennic was just payback for the terrible parking garage design at Naval Intelligence HQ. And the Force will be with you, always. What's up, Meta Nerds? In this video, we are going to take on the Herculean task of trying to figure out the total loss of clone troopers during the 3 years of the Clone Wars. This is going to specifically focus on ground forces, clone troopers that died in combat on-world, not lost as crew members in Republic fleets. We will use 9 of the largest battles of the Clone Wars, and to have realistic stats to draw from, I wanted to take 4 battles from World War II, each with drastically diverse conditions, to see what percentage of a real fighting force was either killed in action or wounded. The Battle of Iwo Jima had 110,000 US troops, 6,821 were killed, and 19,217 were wounded. In the Battle of the Bulge, US troops were 700,000, 19,000 killed, and 54,000 wounded. D-Day had 156,000 Allied troops, 4,414 of which were killed, along with 5,586 wounded. And last, the Battle of Berlin had Soviet and Polish troops at 2,500,000, 81,116 were killed, and 280,251 were wounded. These real-world stats give us a total troop sample size of 3,466,000, with the total killed being 111,351, and total injured at 359,054. This means about 3% are killed, and 10% get injured in major battles. And so we will apply these numbers to the major battles of the Clone Wars, and then we will make some generalizations to try and figure out the entire clone ground troop losses. Starting at the very beginning, there were 192,000 clone troopers on-world for the first Battle of Geonosis. So if we use our World War II stats, we would expect 5,760 killed, and 19,200 injured. Star Wars guidebooks tell us that approximately 20,000 clones were injured, while only providing the vague line that thousands of clone troopers were killed. But I think that because of how close the injured numbers are, we can be confident in the predictive ability of our World War II major battle averages. Also important to consider, there were about 10,000 clone commandos on Geonosis, of which 4,982 were killed. This is a ridiculously high casualty rate, almost half, but I think for sure we can consider this an outlier that shouldn't be generalized to the entirety of the Clone Wars, since they were tasked with entering the Geonosian citadels in order to destroy the droid factories, which forced them into narrow dark corridors that were literally crawling with a unique and violent enemy. Also, the swarming tactics and sound wave based weapons would have negated the effects of their armor. 7 weeks later we have the Battle of Christophsis, and we can see the troop strength with the 13th Army, 327th Star Corps, 501st Legion, Alpha Squad, Bravo Squad, and Slick's Platoon. If we add all these troop amounts up, we get 193,590, a similar number to Geonosis. This would give us 5,807 killed, and 19,359 injured, meaning that we've already filled up 2/3 of a Haven-class medical station's back-to-tanks in just the first couple months of fighting. A few months later, we have the Battle of Ryloth, which had the 501st Legion, Ghost Company, and Lightning Squadron, for a total of 9,371, or 281 killed, and 937 injured. Though, importantly, this does not take into account the likely thousands of Twi'lek allied casualties. In 21 BBY, we go back to the Bug World for the second Battle of Geonosis, which included the 41st Elite Corps, 212th Attack Battalion, 501st Legion, and some squads of Flame Troopers, giving us 46,665 troops on the ground, with 1,400 dead and 4,666 injured. Though many aspects of this operation were a disaster, so I wouldn't be surprised if those numbers were higher. Later that year we have the Battle of Camino, with the Advanced Recon Commandos, Advanced Recon Force Troopers, and the 501st, a total of 9,288, or 279 killed, and 929 wounded. But this is a really good place to make the point that naval battles should be covered in another video, as the number I gave does not account for the tons of losses that were happening with each capital ship that was destroyed. At the nightmare that was Umbara, we had ARF troopers, the 501st, and the 212th Attack Battalion, which gave us a fighting force of 9,827, of which 295 would have died, along with 983 injured. Again, specifics here may be higher, but that is why our World War II averages included devastating battles like D-Day, and some of these would have been friendly fire, due to Pong Krell's treachery. I want to include the invasion of Coruscant during the Battle of Coruscant, because even though it was from the 2003 Clone Wars TV show, it did contain a ton of amazing events, and we have the numbers for it, so why not? This is a long one, but we got the 501st, 3rd Systems Army, 212th Attack Battalion, a platoon of Marines, Shock Troopers, Senate Guards, and even a squad of Red Guards, along with 2 squads of Clone Commandos, and 2 squads of ARC Troopers. This gives us a grand total of 304,856, and remember that doesn't even include the fleets in orbit that were conducting most of the fighting, but this number would give us an estimate of 9,146 killed, and 30,486 injured. Which makes sense that this would be the largest amount of casualties we cover on this list. And now we arrive at the last 2 battles. The Battle of Kashyyyk had Delta, Omega, Bogey, and Triton squads, the 41st Elite Corps, 91st Reconnaissance Corps, 501st Legion, and a Clone Marine Sniper Platoon, giving us 85,320, not including the Wookiees, or 2,560 killed in action, and 8,532 injured. The final battle I want to include is the Battle of Utapau, which had the 501st, the 3rd Systems Army, and a platoon each of Shadow Troopers and Engineers. This gives us 304,200 troops in total, 9,126 killed, and 30,420 wounded. These are definitely not all of the battles of the Clone Wars, but of these 9 major battles, we get a better idea of the amount of casualties for the troops that went through the very worst of what the CIS had to offer. And when you total it all up, you get 39,636 killed, and 115,513 wounded. What we can do to try and figure out the total Republic losses over the length of the Clone Wars is to divide this number by 9, getting the average killed and wounded, and then multiply that by the number of military actions in the Clone Wars. There is an incredibly long list on Wikipedia that I put in the description down below, but it includes some things like just diplomatic talks, or when a couple of Jedi went to a location, so just counting up the battles, invasions, attacks, or defenses, we get a total of 49 military actions. Multiplied by our average, gives us 215,796 clone troops killed, and 628,904 wounded. Given that the number of US troops killed in World War II is estimated to be around 407,316, and the total military force was around 16 million, the average World War II killed in action percentage was 2.5% of the armed forces. And since we have a canon figure for the total amount of clone troopers ordered during the Clone Wars at 6.2 million, 1.2 to start, and 5 million over the next couple of years, We know that 215,796 would be 3.5% of this fighting force, but this was probably a bit high considering that we focused on the 9 biggest battles, and so if we went with the World War II average of 2.5%, it would give us 155,000 clone troopers killed. People listening that know their history immediately understand that this is ridiculously low. Far, far too low for a galactic scale war. Hell, the Russians believe that over 478,000 were killed during the Battle of Stalingrad alone. But again, our math is as accurate as it can be, as the stats from Geonosis say that only 20,000 were injured, matching what our averages would predict, and the 6.2 million clone army total is a canon official stat. Of course, we had to do some averaging and speculating in some areas, so the numbers I gave aren't perfect, but I find it very interesting that our stats are so close to those killed or wounded in World War II, especially since so much of Star Wars tech and tactics are based on World War II combat. So that's it for the breakdown, and the only behind the scenes fact is that I didn't include the Battle of Jabeam, since we only have a battalion of clones listed, or 576 troops, but the casualties are listed at 10,000 plus. I felt like including this would have just confused people even more. And I hope this will spark some amazing conversations in the comments down below. I know a lot of serious history buffs subscribe to the channel, and I want to know what you think of the World War II comparison, and see some theories for why the clone army was so small, and what size you think it should have been. And keep an eye out for a video I'm working on about the organization of the Republic military, and how ridiculously hard it would be for the sector armies to try and control dozens of planets with so little troops. But that's it for the total number of clone ground troops killed during the Clone Wars. But most important of all, remember, Star Wars doesn't have to make sense. It's just fun to do a deep dig sometimes, and the Force will be with you. Always. What's up, meta nerds? So I'm grabbing some clips for an updated, super detailed Venator breakdown, and I see this thing. Kinda wish I could have captured my reaction, even if there were some expletives, but I'm always blown away by the fact that you can still find new things in the background. Some research shows that this is an IW-37 Pincer loader, a droid helping to resupply the largest threat to the droid army.
It's treason, then.
Now on this strip that would open up to reveal the hangar, it looks like you can see some clones walking around too, and it seems like the loader is moving around these large gray containers. If you look at the cross-section for the Venator, it isn't clear where these would be loaded into, but there are a ton of details and openings that are not shown. Even given how big this droid and the containers are, they are still incredibly small compared to the enormous Venator, and thus there could be all kinds of panels and loading areas that open up on this Star Destroyer. What's inside of these containers could be anything from Tabana gas to torpedoes, or Jawa juice and toilet paper. If you look at the IW-37, it has these walker-like feet, but the unit on the back and side protrusions make it look more like a mech, like it was designed to have some sort of cockpit up here. There are some true Star Wars mechs, so be sure to check out our video on them. And in a way, things like AT-STs could also be considered mechs. But I really just wanted to make this short video to draw attention to the scene of the Venator being serviced, and this cool little discovery. Did you know this thing existed? And if you did you catch it the first time you saw the movie, or was it years later? Definitely let me know in the comments down below. I've done videos on other obscure background ships like the Diamond-class Cruiser and the Republic Assault Gunboat, which were both requested by viewers. So if you have any requests, just ask and I'll try and look into it. But most important of all, remember, not all droids are loyal to the cause, and the Force will be with you, always. Tarkin and Vader have a very complex relationship, but long before the Clone Wars, he used Anakin to spy on the Jedi Order. What's up, meta nerds? This story comes from the novel Rogue Planet, and gets into a very interesting task assigned to Tarkin. It is revealed during a conversation with Wraith Sienar of Sienar Fleet Systems, the man behind things like the original Death Star concept and the TIE Fighter. Tarkin is trying to locate a mysterious craft, thought to have been built by Sienar, and he mentions that this mission involves the Jedi. Sienar states that he is a fan of the Jedi and loves stories of their grand adventures. Tarkin admits that they are an intriguing bunch. But in this conversation, he tells Sienar, quote, "One of my assignments, I will not tell you who does the assigning and how much they pay, is to keep track of all the Jedi on Coruscant. Keep track of them and discourage any increase in their power." Now it is important to understand that this is in the year 29 BBY, 7 years before the Clone Wars, 3 years after the Battle of Naboo. Palpatine is the Supreme Chancellor at this time. Tarkin and Sienar have been friends for more than a decade, and Tarkin has considered Palpatine to be his mentor for about just as long. It is never stated explicitly that it was Palpatine that ordered him to spy on the Jedi, but this would have obviously helped in the Sith's plans. But of course, it wouldn't be surprising for Sidious to keep layers of cover between him, perhaps having some other politician or crime boss be the one that contacted Tarkin for this espionage assignment. But all things considered, I really think that it may have just been a direct assignment to Tarkin from Palpatine. They connected on their disdain for the core world aristocrats. Both saw the Republic as a crumbling state, and viewed the Jedi as inept, unwilling, or unable to keep the peace in the galaxy. It makes perfect sense that as Palpatine and Tarkin helped to grow each other's careers and their power, they would find a way to keep an eye on the Jedi. But how did he do it? Well, when we're talking about undermining the Jedi, of course we turn to Anakin. Tarkin had heard of a young Jedi that loved all things mechanical, the kid owned by a junker, and who had built his own droid and pod racer. He knew that the boy would love a project like this, and he says, quote, "I have placed a small, very expensive, very broken droid in the way of this youngster, and he has taken it into the Jedi Temple and made it mobile again, as I suspected he would. And it has been listening to some curious private conversations." Sienar was confused as to why anyone would spy on the Republic's greatest ally, but Tarkin simply waves this off. This droid would become one of Anakin's favorite possessions, and he got a kick out of dressing it up in Jedi robes and sending it through the temple. A bit of foreshadowing for later events, but Obi-Wan remarks that this boy and his prank droid taught him a disturbing truth, that almost all of the Jedi had their guards down while in the confines of the temple. Many other Jedi Knights and Masters didn't even pick up on the fact that there was no life force emanating from this robed being. They were all dangerously at ease. Now, what ultimately happened to this listening device is unknown. Mace Windu was very annoyed at this droid, but it's unclear if he ever smashed it into bits or ordered Anakin to give it up. I really wonder if it lasted up through the Clone Wars, and what bits of information did it pick up that helped Sidious's plans. Certainly, being Anakin's personal property, in the room with him, and listening in on conversations with him and Obi-Wan, would have given Sidious a ton of important psychological data that would be useful in befriending and manipulating the troubled youth. But what do you think of this story? Definitely let me know in the comments down below. But most important of all, remember, the droids are always listening, and the Force will be with you, always. What's up, Meta Nerds? This video is going to be a bit shorter and a lot more informal, but while making part 2 of Ahsoka's complete life, I noticed something that was really interesting. This symbol that we first see on Mortis was later seen on Ilum and even the Jedi Temple on Lothal. This is going to get really crazy, and I definitely want to hear your opinions on this, so be sure to comment them down below. And I'll just lay out all the similarities and connections between these 3 sites, and how it points to the ones being the precursors or creators of the Jedi Order, at a time that would be much further back than any Star Wars material has ever covered. So this symbol is first seen on many different spots on Mortis. I noticed that it was also outside of the structure on Ilum, in this circle where the younglings have to call on the Force to open the temple up. And then when we go inside, we see that it's all over the walls, and again on the floor in multiple locations. The only other place we ever saw this was on Mortis, and it would be on no other location in the Clone Wars. And then we only see it once in Rebels in the Lothal Temple. In both locations, the architecture is very Mortis-like. On Ilum, when the entryway is revealed, look how similar this is to the spire from the Father's dwelling on Mortis. Both here and on Lothal, the exterior is made to look like it is a part of nature, but descends away to reveal the entrance. And inside of both, the lines and angles, doorways, and just overall look is very similar to Mortis. And we also saw that these locations on the ground containing the symbol required the being that was tested to stand inside of it, like when the Father conducted the test to see if Anakin was truly the chosen one. Similarly, the younglings on Ilum stand in this circle containing the Mortis symbol in order to open up this location. And then with Kanan and Ezra, we get the same idea for the Lothal Temple. Which is a really cool detail when they made this episode, and something which makes me think that this does have a connection, something that you really had to pay attention to see, is that throughout this entire episode you never get a good top-down angle. You can't see this symbol until the very end. If you look close, you can just barely see it here, kinda covered in grass, and clearly something that the Rebel show creators did on purpose. Just faint enough to miss it, but if you knew where to look, you would see this Mortis symbol. For more connections, this is also the place where Ezra gets his Kyber crystal, the exact same reason that the younglings went to Ilum. All 3 of these locations also serve to test their visitors. Anakin was shown visions of the future, and haunted by the visions of the past in the form of his mother, while Ahsoka would see a vision of her future self, which tested her confidence in her future as Skywalker's Padawan. Obi-Wan's faith in Anakin would also be tested. Basically, this whole arc was just a series of tests for this trio. Similarly, each of the younglings on Ilum were tested in ways particular to each of their weaknesses. And as we would expect, we see the same thing with Ezra at the Lothal Temple, being plagued with vision after vision that test his fear of losing his master, Kanan Jarrus, and his insecurities as being one of the newest members of the Spectres. Remember, Mortis is a place where the Ones, known only as the Father, the Daughter, and the Son, called home. A location that was in a plane of existence outside of the normal galaxy. They were originally from the normal Star Wars galaxy, but the Father states that long ago he decided that their powers in the Force were too great.
My children and I can manipulate the Force like no other. Therefore, it was necessary to withdraw from the temporal world.
To anyone who might dismiss this arc as some weird one-off, or just something not important to the lore overall, I would point to a lot of things coming back from this arc. Ahsoka is revived here via a Force transfer, something that obviously played a big role in Episode 9, and I think it's the first time this is ever shown on screen. And then things like the bird that represents the daughter having this still not fully understood connection with Ahsoka, while what might be the most important of all is the time travel aspect introduced in Rebels, with the past and the future of both Anakin and Ahsoka being a major factor in the Mortis arc, and we see the Ones being on the entrance to the world between worlds. The Mortis arc in the Clone Wars is both canon and Legends, but that arc was older and could have been easily just ignored in canon, leaving it to the sort of dream or hallucination explanation that a lot of fans went with. Instead, they bring the Ones back to be depicted on the Gateway on Lothal. Not some sort of dream, but the very real world between worlds, which has doors that open up to different locations across the galaxy, allowing one to play with the rules of time. An ability that the Ones had, with the Father getting extremely mad at the Son for showing Anakin visions of his potential future. So their existence as being important in canon as well has definitely been cemented in the new lore. But what I'm saying is that this connection with the symbols and the similarities of these locations is that the Ones may have been the originators of the Jedi Order. I think that's the breadcrumbs we're supposed to follow from both Rebels and the Clone Wars. An order which in the past must have also included practice of what later Jedi would call the dark side. On Mortis, we see that the Ones know how the Jedi view themselves and the Sith, and see the Jedi Order's whole dichotomy to be incredibly oversimplified. The Jedi's weapon is the lightsaber, and its power comes from the Force coming through the Kyber crystal. These crystals work as a gateway between the physical world and the metaphysical power of the Force. If we are to believe that the Lothal Temple, the entry to the world between worlds, and the Ilum Temple were all built by the Ones, then it seems that while the Father decided to remove himself from the galaxy in order to keep some sort of balance, he created these locations to test worthy individuals across the ages. As the Ones were once physical, and became purely non-physical, the Ones made these Kyber crystals to act as a conduit, a physical thing that can channel the Force into a weapon that can be used by both those who wish to spread light and those who wish to spread dark. A power that you could only receive if you could pass the trial in the buildings that each bear this Mortis symbol. And this role of the Kyber crystal is also the role of the Force user themselves. Again, as if the writers are trying to give us clues here, the very first words we see spoken inside of the Ilum Temple are these.
The Force, made physical, a Jedi is. Comes great responsibility with that, yes?
Yoda is saying that the Jedi is a conduit through which the Force can take action in this physical world. While the embodiment of the Force is on Mortis, this physical universe would be the greatest test site of all. While Ilum and Lothal had their specific tests for their specific goals, it is as if the Ones use this physical universe as one big test of character. The Father wants there to be dark and conflict with the light, and ensures that if you are to embark in this struggle, you too will be tested. With most of the greatest Jedi throughout the ages, all seeing life as a series of trials placed on you by the Force itself. This naturally got me thinking of Kreia, who I think rightly identified the Force as the font of all suffering. That in this setup, where Force-sensitive beings receive immense power to do good or enormous amounts of evil, in a universe where souls of each and every being are constantly tested with hardship, you could prevent all of this if only you could destroy the Force. And interestingly, the Vong from outside the galaxy that the Ones originated from do not interact with the Force at all, neither using it or being affected by it. So if we want to think in terms of Legends, as the Ones and Mortis also exist in Legends, it's kind of cool to think how all this could sync up. So I just thought that was all really neat. Not sure what they'll do with that, but I definitely think that these ancient Jedi sites were actually created by the Ones, and may play a larger role in Star Wars metaphysics in general. I don't know how I didn't catch these symbols being in all three of these places before, but definitely let me know if you did, and comment what you make of all of this. But most important of all, remember, it's all one big Force trial, and the Force will be with you, always. What's up, meta nerds? This video is all about the Shard species, and the Iron Knights that they became. These are one of the strangest species in all of Star Wars, as most life in the galaxy seems to be carbon-based, just like life found here on Earth. But these crystal creatures are actually silicon-based life. As you might have expected, something this weird of course was located in the Outer Rim, and found exclusively on the mineral-rich world of Orax. They grew in large colonies that were groups of hundreds or thousands of individual shards, each springing up out of the planet's hot springs. Each member of the colony could communicate to each other via electromagnetic impulses that were conducted across their crystal bodies, and processed by their non-centralized brains, something similar to what is found in leeches. Each shard would grow off of its parents, but with distinct silicon structures from their parents, making it something like the shard's DNA. Their electromagnetic sense was their only way of interacting with the world, but some also contained a mysterious connection with the Force. And even though the Galactic Republic was around for tens of thousands of years, this planet was not discovered until 119 BBY, making for a sudden and violent shift in the shard's history. The original human colonists didn't even realize that these were living beings, but once they did, it became one of the most exciting discoveries for biologists, and the next big contribution to their field would be to figure out how their minds work, and how they communicate, spawning several research projects that eventually led to an understanding of how to translate these electromagnetic pulses, paving the way for the creation of translator units. These units could be used by other species to understand the shard, and eventually the shard were able to use these in order to understand their carbon-based brothers from across the galaxy. But then the real breakthrough came from taking this tech just a step further by creating droid bodies that house the shard, allowing them to control the limbs with those electric pulses, while also being able to speak through the translator. It's hard to appreciate just how revolutionary this was for the shard society and their species, as even though they were already self-aware in their static state, I would say that the dramatic jump in experiences available to the shard is similar to when humans became self-aware. The expansion of the shard mind gave them a voracious appetite for all things sensory, as tech in these suits could provide tactile, image, and sound stimulation, operating like nerves from the skin, ears, and eyes of other species. All of these modes of experiencing the world were completely new, and it was like living on a new plane of existence. And when you combine that with something that we definitely take for granted, the ability to actually move throughout the world, and you can see how this generation of shards experienced something like hyper-evolution. This change also stripped them from the hive mind status that was present for every generation of shards at a colony, a collective consciousness that was there immediately from birth, and a shard that separated himself from this caused radical philosophical and self-awareness breakthroughs. With this literal separation from their community, one of the most troubling ideas was the realization that their life was finite, if still multiple millennia long, and that they wouldn't contribute to the chain of crystals. It may seem silly and inconsequential to us, but just consider how the need to leave a legacy and reproduce seems so crucial to human psychology. For the first time in their history, their community was fractured, with static crystals criticizing the new cyborgs, while other crystals were eager to hear the stories of their star-traveling relatives. The final blow to the traditional shard society came when mining guilds from across the galaxy descended on this mineral-rich planet, and didn't see these living crystals as particularly interesting life that was worth saving. This caused groups in the Senate to establish delegations that defended the shard's rights, though many of these ambassadors were killed off by assassins that were hired by the mining guilds. The delegates that replaced them accepted bribes, or were intimidated into striking contracts with the shard that allowed for the destruction of their colonies, and which quickly led to the planet being overrun by foreign slave workers and heavy mining equipment. More and more shard decided that staying on their home colony was not viable, and so they accelerated this problem even further by just agreeing to give up mineral rights in exchange for top-of-the-line droid bodies. Palpatine's Galactic Empire would take over in the middle of this transition, and he just flat out killed the remaining ambassadors and went the extra step of banning any form of droid from ever stepping foot on Orax, preventing the cyborgs from saving their ancestors. This turned many of the shard to fight with the Alliance to restore the Republic, and some of them were particularly Force-sensitive, leading to the creation of the Iron Knights. The first of these actually appeared in 50 BBY, but they would hide out for over 70 years, until the creation of Luke's new Jedi Order. Luke accepted these Silicon Knights into the Order, and they were able to protect the galaxy from the intergalactic invaders, the Yuuzhan Vong. In the second year of that war, the year 26 ABY, one of these Iron Knights turned to the dark side after the destruction of Hosk Station, and seeing the power of the technophobic Zong, Luxem sought to gain more power through the dark side, and even got himself an apprentice in IG-179, a former guard for General Grievous. This shard was killed by the Vong during the 4-Year War, but the overall fate of his species, and the Iron Knights, is unknown. So that's it for their history, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. There was another sentient crystal species known as the Tassil, who, though similar, had a vastly different history and range of abilities. The Shard first appeared in Star Wars Adventure Journal 15, Alien Encounters the Shard. And the concept of silicon-based life is an actual theory of possible life that might exist in the universe, because silicon is in the same group as carbon on the periodic table, and is also tetravalent, meaning it could form 4 covalent bonds, thus giving it a greater likelihood of creating strings of molecules in a similar way to carbon, which eventually might produce life. The only sci-fi problem that might exist for the Shard is that they were too similar to rocks, being that they couldn't actually move, and thus had no behaviors that they could enact in the world, which according to most evolutionary theories, would make it impossible for them to develop any sense of self, or really any sophisticated senses at all, as there would be nothing to cause this species to change over time, as nature would not be selecting for or against any of their traits. And the infamous droid Skippy, a Force-sensitive R5-D4 that escaped from servitude to Jabba, that was almost made into a Shard that was using this astromech as its cyborg body, via this story in Droid's Technology in the Force, A Clash of Phenomena. So that's it for the Shard species and the Iron Knights. But most important of all, remember, crystal jewelry is murder, and the Force will be with you, always. What's up, Meta Nerds? This video will be a complete breakdown of an obscure but very interesting droid, LA-L9, seeing how it inspired ZX-3 and then the Dark Trooper program. This droid unit was intended to replace the Clone Trooper during the war, meaning that if the plans of TAGCO came to fruition, it would have been full droid-on-droid warfare across the galaxy. The large, powerful, and still family-controlled TAGCO had close ties to Republic top brass, and immediately after the galaxy heard the details of the Battle of Naboo, with everything from droid starfighters to battle droids, Orman Tag could see the galaxy was headed for even greater conflicts. And the first to convince the Republic to adopt their own droid army would become the richest man in the galaxy. Over the next decade, his company would conduct a complicated symphony of movements, with Orman acting as orchestrator, using everything from corporate espionage, compromising politicians to earn their loyalty, to acquiring the right engineers and raw materials to create the droid soldier the Republic couldn't say no to. With each year that passed, it was increasingly clear that the Civil War was coming. 28 ABY saw a dramatic shift towards planetary leaders putting their own planet's interests ahead of the Republic as a ruling body. And by 24 BBY, the Confederacy of Independent Systems was declared, 2 years before war would break out on Geonosis. We can imagine TAGCO holo terminals were slammed, and corporate espionage experts were screamed at when Orman Tag got word that apparently the Republic had an enormous army kept in secret, a clone trooper army with all their needs already very well met. After hitting some spice and meeting with his top advisors, the company decided that their LA-L9 droid had to be rushed into production, and that with some changes, they could take advantage of the nature of the clone army. Since the Jedi had decided to go with a foolish, organic design for their troopers, there would be a need for droid units that could brave dangerous environments. As the war spread, there were countless battlefronts in poisonous gas clouds, deep underwater, in intense heat, or in the vacuum of space. So if the Tag droid could shine in these battles, he was confident it would convince the top brass to phase out the organics in favor of this powerful design. Equipped with the most advanced servo motors and equilibrium centers of its day, this bulky seeming droid was actually far more nimble than something like the B-2, which, like its CIS competitor, this droid had weapons built into its arms, being able to adjust the plasma flow to send out flames or bolts of plasma like a blaster, with the flames being useful in causing spreading damage throughout an enemy ship or base, and hitting the enemy even if they were behind cover or using some sort of physical shielding. While the plasma cannon was more powerful than any blaster out there, strong enough to fry portable shield generators and droidicas. The head of this droid was designed to be a nod to the Phase 1 helmets, hoping this would make them look like they could fit into the army. and this dome houses the enhanced sensor globe that gave it a 360-degree view of the battlefront and a wider spectrum of light than the organic eye. The mask-looking device is an atmospheric sampler, which ensured that it could stay operable and transmit this data to Republic strategists. With generators and processors located in the chest, along with thick plate armor to protect it, and we also see these layers down the legs. It used technology and materials to make it immune to most electromagnetic bursts, which means it didn't share the same EMP weakness that most battle droids had. And even its little fingertips are weapons. Little blast nozzles spun these blades at a rate that allowed it to cut through solid durasteel. Now, TAG did have one problem, that of course the powerhouses of the Kaminoan cloners and Kuat drive yards would not be happy to see a newcomer trying to carve out a slice of their pie, and it was also highly illegal to develop a droid army. It had been so since the invasion of Naboo, even more so since the Clone Wars broke out. So this top secret program wanted to get real-world feedback that would be so impressive that the Republic would overlook this issue and have to say yes to some lucrative contracts. The leaders of this project decided that they would get real-world feedback from the barbaric arena death matches being held on the backwater planet of Ratatak. TAG would head there personally, and was so confident his 10 years of planning would result in a bloodbath, visualizing how the other contestants would be crushed, cut, burned, and blasted to death, that he put up 100,000 credits of his own money on the fight. In a way, this fight would be a success in some ways, as it held its own against the greatest warriors in the galaxy, and even rapidly identified Asajj Ventress as the greatest threat. Everything was working right, but it was still no match for the Force in the hands of a Sith assassin. Before it could fry her head off, she rocketed the prototype up into the rocks, ending this droid's hopes in a fiery explosion. Such a dramatic and public dispatching of TAG's decade-long dream droid project left him embarrassed, and he lost all faith in LA-L9. And he lost that 100K. Knowing this fight was recorded for the Hollows, he chose to avoid the embarrassment and any blowback that the major rival companies like Kuat, who just might manipulate the Senate and media to make it look like TAG was building a secret droid army for the Separatists. The fact that Dooku hosted this tournament certainly was bad optics. So though he gave up on this, the spark of the idea was never fully extinguished. And as the war raged on, and Republic became the Empire, General Rom Mok would come to work with TAG Co. to bring about droid troopers for the Empire. The first iteration was the ZX-3 experimental droid trooper, considered the second generation of the LA-L9, being the same height and pitched for the same purpose, for areas too dangerous for stormtroopers to travel. This time, the design was made to be able to use other weapons with functional hands and a modular chest attachment, seen usually carrying a blaster rifle or Berletto AAP-4 blaster box. Sadly, top Imperial brass had the bad metallic taste of droids from the past war still in their mouths, and wanted nothing to do with droid soldiers. The roughly 100 models made for the Empire to test out were all ordered to be scrapped near instantly. But Rom Mok wouldn't give up on this either, and he and TAG were finally able to get a hit with the Dark Trooper project. Starting as a bit of a recycling job, with Phase 0 of the Dark Trooper project being made by taking top clone veterans and turning them into cyborgs by removing 70% of their body parts in the hopes of keeping their organic mind and battlefront wisdom, with all the advantages of a steel body and digital sensors. This evolved to be pure droid versions from Phase 1 on, all the way up to Phase 3, an Imperial droid trooper that would end up outliving the Empire itself in the service of Moff Gideon. While around the same time, ZX-3, an Imperial droid that survived the mass scrapping, rose up to lead a revolution on the droid world of Kligzin's moon. His droid army was raised to fulfill his secret wish to turn the world over to his Imperial masters, still being loyal deep into his circuits. But when he was killed, the revolution died out, and the ZX-3 was finally extinct. And the only hope this line survives would be from whatever source Moff Gideon secured his Dark Troopers. So that's it for this odd but fascinating droid line. For behind the scenes facts, the ZX-3 is one of the earliest droids in the history of Star Wars, being first seen in the comic Star Wars 47, released in 1981, while it got its name and details from the Essential Guide to Droids in 2006, which also had the breakdown on the LA-L9. While the Dark Trooper lore came from a variety of RPG sources and games, being finally shown on screen in The Mandalorian. Let me know what you think. Will we ever see a full droid-on-droid war, or is keeping it droids versus people more interesting? If you like this, you'll be sure to like these videos. Likes, comments, and shares are the best ways to help me out. Check out the membership, subscribe if you want to see more, but most important of all, remember, never bet against a Sith, and the Force will be with you, always. What's up, meta nerds? This video is all about CT-5385, also known as Tup. Tup was a member of the 501st Legion, which served under the command of Jedi General Anakin Skywalker, and later became the 501st Battalion of Darth Vader, where it earned the nickname Vader's Fist. One of the few times when command was transferred over to another Jedi General, Tup and the 501st served under Pong Krell during the Battle of Umbara. This was one of the most intense battles of the Clone Wars, and perhaps did the greatest damage to the Republic's image, as Krell decided that he would use the siege of Umbara to impress his future master Count Dooku. Krell believed the Republic was doomed to lose the Clone Wars, and wanted to be on the winning side, so he deliberately chose tactics that would bring about the most clone casualties, something which Jesse and Fives took notice of. They could not see that it was full treason, but thought that in the very least, the Basilisk Jedi had no respect for clone life. When they betrayed Krell's orders, he had them court-martialed and sent to be executed, and though Dogma ordered the clones to fire on their brothers, the troopers of the firing squad, including Kix and Tup, intentionally missed their shots and threw down their blasters. Rex saluted this defiance of Krell's orders, but right after this, the 501st had to rush off and engage a wave of Umbaran fighters who were quickly descending on their position. Through the eerie glow of the dense jungles, a chaotic firefight erupted, but Rex realized that they were firing on other clones. It is unknown how many brothers from the 212th Tup may have killed, but the dying words from Waxer revealed that Krell had set this whole thing up. Together, Obi and Annie's troopers teamed up to relieve the general of his duties, and in the fight that ensued, Tup was nearly killed by the terrifying creature known as the Vixis. Tup told the clones to lure Krell near the creature, and though it did capture the Jedi, the traitor was able to cut himself free, and would have escaped, if it wasn't for Tup's perfectly timed stun blast. But his status as Hero of the Republic would not last for very long, as the event that he would become most known for was his own murderous betrayal. Although the official reason for this is that his bioinhibitor chip malfunctioned, causing him to execute Clone Protocol 66, I do wonder if malfunction was the best word to use. I'm not at all blaming Tup for this, but it's an interesting point about these chips that a lot of people don't consider. It isn't like this chip was separate, a completely detached piece of technology that would only work top-down, like a computer microchip that just sends electrical impulses to the brain. Instead, this was organic, inserted into their brain from the third stage of embryonic development, so it would be affected by other neurons in the clone trooper's brain. We don't know what happened with Dogma, the clone that actually killed Pong Krell, but I believe that Tup's involvement in defying his Jedi General, firing on him even if in stun mode, would affect a biofeedback loop associated with the actions programmed into the inhibitor chip. This chip would have to work on a voice command that when the Emperor says execute Order 66, the brain does some set of actions XYZ. But to use an oversimplified neuroscience phrase, neurons that fire together wire together, these series of neurons could also be activated backwards, that when a clone does actions similar to XYZ, it would in some ways activate the inhibitor chip. Like I said, this is a gross oversimplification, perhaps a whole video on how inhibitor chips could work, and real-life examples should be done one day, but this feedback loop is in part one of the theories for déjà vu, where your actions and or stimuli may be so close to those of a memory that it partially excites those stored memories, and you may feel like you experienced this moment long ago. It is also why doing something like hitting a punching bag may bring up memories of fights, or even just things related to fighting. Doing the action brings forth the stored memory, and the inhibitor chip is a form of stored memory, that as a clone, I know I am supposed to kill the Jedi when I hear Order 66. So it is very interesting that it would be the clone who fired on a Jedi in the past that would snap into this trance and eventually kill a Jedi on Ringo Vinda. Of course, it is probably multiple variables coming together at once, like this memory feedback loop, an actual malfunction in the chip, and Tup's own genetic variants, as Jedi General Tiplar was definitely not a threat to Tup or a traitor, but I definitely wanted to present you guys with this idea that the memory feedback loop may have interfered with the inhibitor chip. After Tup was tackled by Rex, he was detained and transferred to Kamino for examination. The cover was that the attack was the result of a separatist virus, but Fives grew suspicious and was able to extract the inhibitor chip. As Tup lies on the operating table, his voice is one of relief, not fear, as he realizes that he is about to die. Tup mutters about being free from the mission. Five is confused as to what mission he's talking about, to which he gets the response, "You know the one in our dreams, that never ends. Oh brother, this is the end. Forget the mission, oh the nightmare. I'm free." Although he was confused at first as to what mission Tup was talking about, once he says the one from our dreams, Five seems to get it, and you have the fact that Tup expected him to understand the phrase, "You know the one," and our dreams, which makes me think that the clones may have discussed this weird dream that they all had, perhaps ones in which they killed the Jedi. This would make sense for what I was saying earlier about the chip being integrated into their brain, and thus you would expect that these subconscious aspects of their thoughts would be likely to reveal themselves in some form in the clones' dreams. In other videos, I have talked about how Kaminoans said that humans were one of the most difficult species to clone completely identical due to the wide amount of variables in genes and personality. So imagine how hard it would be for a non-human species to try and hide programmed actions from the conscious mind without taking into account or even fully understanding the human mind's self-analysis ability through the act of dreaming. So that's it for the life of Tup, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind-the-scenes stuff. Tup may be one of the most gangster clones of all time, since he was the first to kill a Jedi, and he also had a teardrop tattoo, which is a known prison and gang tattoo, mostly used to symbolize that you have killed someone, although there is a very different second explanation for it, which I will leave on screen for you to pause if you want to read it. But really, either of these meanings is a surprisingly dark choice for a design on a Clone Wars character that appears on Cartoon Network. Even his name can be seen as a bit provocative. With Tup having two meanings in British English, it could just mean ram, but if you use Tup as a verb, you're talking about the kind of reproduction done outside of the Kaminoan laboratory. So yes, kids, there is a Clone Wars character with a teardrop gang tattoo, and whose name is slang for the F word. So that's it for CT-5385, also known as Tup. But more important than all that, remember, you're not yourself when you have an inhibitor chip, and the Force will be with you. Always. What's up, Meta Nerds? In this video, we are going to answer the question, what happened if you didn't want to be a clone trooper? We will look at incidents where clones were terminated on Kamino, others who just thought about leaving, and those who actually did leave the army, either on purpose or without them even knowing it. An important thing to remember is that we are in a completely different situation from the clones that makes it difficult to compare to human armies here on Earth. The Kaminoans are running a business and would have invested a lot of credits into each clone's creation long before that clone became aware of his own existence. Of course, this is why raising sentient, self-aware beings for the purpose of selling as commodities is one of the most morally reprehensible things a society can do. Critiquing the hypocrisy of the Republic could be an entire playlist, but the main logical failure here is that many believe that if a clone ever tried to leave the military, he was breaking a sort of contract. He was seen as a deserter, since he was a part of the military long before he ever left the growth chamber, and he wouldn't even be alive if it wasn't for the Kaminoans. This is silly for the reasons I previously mentioned. You can't be held to a contract you didn't freely enter, but you combine bad logic with indoctrination and biological modification, and you got yourself what is probably the most loyal organic army in the history of the galaxy, and hell, there might even be more droids that went against their narrow programming. So let's start at the beginning, with the prototype clones known as the Null Advanced Recon Commandos. This unit would later transform to become the famous ARC Troopers, and the Nulls were the Kaminoans' first attempt at trying to find a balance between obedient and badass. And we know for sure that they manipulated the frontal cortex, hippocampus, and most likely the amygdala, as these clones were altered to have eidetic memory, better than any natural human, but some could not regulate their emotions, having wild, unruly outbursts. With this very first case, we see how the Kaminoans treated disobedience, as these Nulls were deemed unsatisfactory units for sale, and set for execution. These clones were set to be killed because it was evident that they were not completely obedient, and essentially were found guilty of desertion that they might commit one day in the future. Plus, they would have just hurt the Kaminoans' cloning reputation. And the only reason why they were saved was from Cal Skirata and Jango Fett saying that they would take ownership and train them. You know you're evil when you make Mandalorian mercs look like the compassionate guys. I talk more about the Nulls in the Alpha 17 video, but important for this video is the story of Alpha 30. He was trained by Skirata and deployed to the planet Gaftika in order to train the locals to overthrow their CIS-leaning government. When he was captured, he revealed some details about other clone Nulls that tried to desert the Grand Army of the Republic. He tells the story of fellow Null Arc Tavo, who shortly after he tried deserting, was hunted down and executed by Republic intelligence officers. Tavo was inspired by the successful escape of Alpha 02, also known as Spar, who was one of the most wanted men in the galaxy before, during, and after the Clone Wars. He was able to escape the Taipoka military complex, by stowing himself away on Jango's Slave 1, and would spend most of his life dodging Republic and Imperial assassins, while trying to grow the Mandalorian commandos, before becoming Mandalore the Resurrector. You could say that the Kaminoans just treated the Gnolls like this, because they knew that they were a sort of superhuman variant, with bad tempers and extra aggression, too dangerous to unleash on the galaxy without supervision. They tried to fix this, and from the Gnolls they created the second batch Alphas, who were still very independent, but not as crazy, letting the Kaminoans understand how to slide that scale a bit further, to create clone commanders, and the least independent and most obedient, your average rank-and-file troopers. These regular clones were decanted in groups of 32, making a clone platoon, and basically did everything together, from childhood training, on through service in the Clone Wars. This meant that even when troopers started to have doubts, they had an entire social structure in place to provide the peer pressure needed to just conform, and all of the clones were drilled with the command code since their earliest memories. This also meant that clones mostly just interacted with their platoon, but they did take notice of the clones that started to disappear. Even during the original conversation with Higo Damask, the cover for Darth Plagueis, the Kaminoans mentioned that humans have particularly high genetic variation that always works its way in no matter what they do, with superficial things like eye color and some minor facial differences, but some cases were so severe that they needed to receive special reconditioning. This is stunning considering that the Kaminoans were perfectionists and control freaks, but 3.5% of clones were deficient enough to receive this reconditioning that could range from gene therapy to outright execution. One case on record was a group of clones that were killed for having less than 20/20 vision, with other clones seeing them escorted out of their sleeping quarters in the middle of the night, never to be heard from again. Despite these strict quality control measures, there was at least one clone that made it through, a man that would come to be known as the Mad Clone of Caecilius. The Caecilius campaign was a part of the intense operation known as Dirge's Lance, where the CIS launched deadly raids on Republic assets, and it was in the middle of the fighting that this clone murdered all of the batchmates in his platoon, and just calmly sat down and rested in a field amongst his dead brothers, before being discovered by a different clone platoon. The Mad Clone confidently proclaimed that he completed the simulation, and that these bodies they were looking at weren't clones at all, but BX series droid commandos, wearing clone armor. Satisfied that he had pleased the Kaminoans watching from their observation ship, he asked this new platoon if his simulation was done, and they were going to give it a run. I think we can assume that if he was not disposed of after this, it is only because of the intervention of the Jedi. Speaking of those force-wielding monks, they are actually the only reason why the killing of those like the bad eyesight batch were stopped, something we glimpsed with Shaak Ti's treatment of Domino Squad. The Kaminoans might not have realized it, but the compassion shown by the Jedi actually strengthened their reputation as cloners, and made their product seem a lot more loyal than it would have otherwise, as we saw with clones like Heavy, who were about to go AWOL. He was convinced to stay because of 99, a defective clone who was saved from extermination by a Jedi's recommendation. But the bigger point here, that the Jedi brought an atmosphere of compassion and higher purpose to the clones' lives, without which many more would have broken. But from here, I think we need to mention the two clones that were still able to desert, Cut and Gregor. Remember, these two were designed to have less free will than the Alphas and Gnolls that had deserted previously, but they also were not that exposed to compassionate Jedi influences. Let's take a look at Cut first. He only made it through one battle, the opening of the Clone Wars during the first Battle of Geonosis. While his squad was leaving upon a transport, it was shot down by Confederate gunships, and when Cut regained consciousness, he found all of his brothers were either dead or severely injured. As the gunship circled back and dropped off a droid search party, Cut decided that he had to leave his brothers behind. We can never critique this difficult decision, but it is interesting to wonder how other clones would have responded. Would Rex have been able to figure out a way to save the injured? Would Thorn have stayed behind with his brothers and gone down in a blaze of glory? We will never know, but Cut was able to make it off-world, though he didn't seek contact with the Republic. Instead, he went into hiding before falling in love with a Twi'lek and living the simple life of a farmer and adoptive father. I find it interesting that the only rank-and-file clone trooper that we know for sure made the conscious decision to desert had just suffered a major trauma, both physically, as he was likely to have suffered a concussion, as he was knocked unconscious for an unknown amount of time, but also psychologically, since he had to see his dead brothers strewn about, followed by the guilt of having to leave behind his wounded brothers, knowing that they would be mercilessly executed by droids. We know each concussion you suffer causes structural changes to the brain, but even psychological trauma causes structural changes as well, with it being well documented that PTSD does damage to the hippocampus and amygdala, areas of the brain known for regulating emotions, learning, and memory. So one of the areas the Kaminoans would have definitely interfered with when trying to make an army of skilled but always obedient soldiers. The cloners used Jango Fett as a template, but they made them a bit more docile and subservient, meaning the structure of the hippocampus could not have been identical to Jango's. Remember, not knowing exactly how much of this to alter is what made some of the Null clones so emotionally unstable. Cut's desertion may just be the result of a culmination of different incidents that allowed him to break free from the army, as he was forced to leave his brothers behind in order to survive, and perhaps most importantly, he had to deal with this all alone. So Cut hadn't seen much combat, wouldn't have been around Jedi for very long, and instead of being a part of military life, around others that could have normalized the experiences and provided much needed camaraderie, Cut experienced this traumatic event and then was isolated for what could have been months. This incident forced Cut to see that he could make it without the cloners, Jedi, or even his brothers, so when he finally gained access off-world and could rejoin the Republic, he just decided not to do so. I think seeing how all of these variables came together, it not only shows us why, but more importantly for creatures that are biologically altered to be obedient, we can now see how he was able to desert. In Gregor's case, we again see that he at least suffered physical trauma to the brain, as he was a special operations member who then fought with the 212th, where his unit was attacked on Serish. Gregor got some serious blows to the head, as he ended up in a shuttle, flies away, crash lands on Abafar, and forgets all of this. Complete retrograde amnesia is caused when trauma occurs in, you guessed it, the hippocampus. Gregor of course did not choose to desert, but this damage was necessary to break the biological control. Of course he joined back up, but this can be explained because 1, his life was pretty dismal on Abafar, but mostly 2, the brain is complex. Lobes are not little machines that do one task exclusively, so with the overwhelming evidence presented to him by Gascon, where he could actually see his old captain, other pathways in his brain would have been activated, since his entire existence revolved around being a clone trooper, from the time he left the growth chamber. But now I want to end with the story of Fives, and I really want to show how his case is the culmination of all of these principles we mentioned earlier, combined with a bit of luck. Here we can see a backfiring of the peer pressure, strong group identity of your whole being dedicated to fighting for the Republic, and unwaveringly following the orders of the Jedi, and being identical to each of your batchmate brothers, all facts fundamental to Fives' existence that were shattered when he saw Tup lose control and gun down a Jedi. In a way, these Jedi generals provided the clones with a meaning for life, facilitating them in carrying out the purpose that they were literally born for. Imagine the kind of insane existential crisis that this would have created in Fives. It would have pulled apart the seams of his entire upbringing. A Separatist-made virus was blamed for causing Tup's actions, but Fives was skeptical, already doubting the Kaminoans, since he would have heard rumors of the other defective clones that were disposed of, and knew that the cloners had altered the troopers' brains. This suspicion, combined with happenstance that the droid attending to him would let it slip that the Kaminoans intended to wipe his memories and reassign him to maintenance duty, and Fives was able to cut through the veil and uncover the existence of the inhibitor chip. It was just bad luck for the Kaminoans and Palpatine that the droid would have accidentally revealed the memory wipe. But then again, as Obi-Wan says,
"In my experience, there's no such thing as luck."
So perhaps the Force itself was involved here. If not biologically altered via the midichlorians that were in all living things, at least the compassionate element introduced by the Jedi is what allowed some of the clone troopers to later defy Order 66. In the book Dark Lord: Rise of Darth Vader, we see that Palpatine understood this variable very well. The Emperor informed his enforcer of clones that deliberately disobeyed Order 66, and aided in their Jedi general's escape. The quote reads, "What was the cause of the troopers' insubordination, Master?" Vader asked. "Contagion," Palpatine sneered. "Contagion brought about by fighting alongside the Jedi for so many years. Clone or otherwise, there is only so much a being can be programmed to do. Sooner or later, even a lowly trooper will become the sum of his experiences." So in conclusion, the only clones that leave the army are the Nulls, who had too much autonomy and individual thinking, and Cut and Gregor, who we both know for sure suffered brain trauma. Deserting the clone army is to go against their own biology, and the only ones who defied their inhibitor chip either knew Fives enough to trust him, or had a strong enough bond with the Jedi. You can look at this Jedi influence as being just a psychological change, or because all living things have midichlorians, the living force could have also changed some aspects of their biology. So that's it for what happened if you wanted to leave the clone army, and our discussion of how it was even possible for some clones to do so. But more important than all that, remember, always trust your friends, and the Force will be with you. Always. So the Star Wars galaxy has this material Cortosis, which is lightsaber resistant. Jedi can't just slice through it, so why don't we see more Sith and just criminals in general scooping up all the Cortosis that they can get and turning it into some sort of defense or even weapons? Well, the story comes from Darth Plagueis actually explains how the Republic and Jedi work together to try and ban any Cortosis mining across the galaxy. Our story takes us to Valdemnik, an outer rim world where Darth Plagueis and his master Darth Tenebris are using their droids to hunt down a Cortosis mine. Plagueis says that Cortosis is, quote, a fabled ore owing to its scarcity, but even more for its intrinsic ability to diminish the effectiveness of the Jedi lightsaber. For that reason, the Jedi Order had gone to great lengths to restrict mining and refinement of the ore. Then this is followed up by a very cool Bane reference, quote, if not the bane of the Order's existence, Cortosis was a kind of irritant. Darth Bane used to mine Cortosis when he was younger, a little less than 1,000 years before this story, and this part of the book takes place in 67 BBY, if you were curious. We find out that the Jedi, quote, who by means of an agreement with the Republic Senate, had first claim to all discoveries, as they also had with the Deegan crystals and the Force-sensitive younglings of all species. So basically the Jedi and the Senate have an agreement that anybody who is Force-sensitive gets reported to the Jedi. Any Deegan crystals, which are basically like Kyber crystals that were used to make lightsabers, anybody who discovers those has to report it to the Senate, and then it gets reported to the Jedi. And then, of course, any of the Cortosis that is found anywhere in the galaxy by any privately owned organizations, all of that has to be reported, and basically you can't lay claim to it. The Jedi get to come, scoop it all up, and we actually don't hear what they do with it, but I assume they dispose of it somehow. Or perhaps it'd be pretty interesting if they made their own weapons or shields for stuff, just in case there was ever a Sith uprising like the times of the Old Republic, where there's just thousands of Sith. So that'd be a pretty interesting thing to find more details about maybe in future Star Wars material. The problem for the Jedi is that they didn't even know the Sith existed at this time, and so the Sith across these different generations were able to take advantage of their secrecy. Tenebris and generations of Sith before him had cultivated relationships across the galaxy which acted as covert informants, supplying them with the locations before they were reported to the Republic. Interestingly, Tenebris was looking into this enormous Cortosis vein so that it could be used to make shields. In the book, you get a feeling that it's a pretty large vein of Cortosis, so he wasn't just making shields for him and his apprentice. It's interesting to wonder if these were to be Cortosis shields for some sort of future Sith army. And I think it's pretty interesting that Valdemnik was featured in the 2003 Clone Wars TV show, and that this Cortosis vein was eventually processed by the mining guild of the CIS. The CIS had the experimental droid, the CB-3 Cortosis droid, which was so deadly that Palpatine feared it would ruin his plans. Basically that he wouldn't be able to manipulate the Clone Wars, and it would have resulted in the CIS actually winning. As Darth Sidious, he found out the location of the droid manufacturing, and then he made sure that that information fell into the hands of the Jedi, who sent a task force that destroyed the facility. I think it's pretty cool that the book went out of the way to give this detail on what happened to Cortosis, because it's something that always made me wonder why don't we see a lot more of it. Even if it was rare, you still have mining companies across the galaxy, so somebody was discovering the stuff, and I've always wondered what they did with it. But you can see how this could build up some resentment with the Jedi Order, especially if you spend a whole bunch of money to try and uncover the stuff, you know it's incredibly valuable, and yet you just kind of have to give it away. So perhaps maybe the Jedi found some way to compensate them for the Cortosis, that would be cool, but we don't have any details specifically on that. But yeah, that's it for this part of the story. We're going to keep them coming, keeping all these little Darth Plagueis interesting parts coming at you. So be sure to like and subscribe. Special shout out to our patrons. If you want to connect with us social media and all that stuff, or buy your own copy of the book. We're listening to it on Audible, but we got Audible links and the physical copies of the book, all linked down in the description. So if you pick up one of those, it'll help support the channel. But more important than all that, remember, the Force will be with you. Always. Once you see it, you're never going to be able to unsee it. What's up, Meta Nerds? This video is all about the Mandalorian Iron Heart, or in Mandoa, the Beskar Karta. So if you look at Mandalorian armor, you'll see that these later versions all have this shape in the middle. All different suits of Mandalorian armor used by Jango, Boba, Death Watch, and even the later Protectors all have it. And what's really interesting is that the Mandalorian from the new show does not have it at first. But once he gets that full set of Beskar armor, you see that there is a perfect Mandalorian Iron Heart. A really cool touch that will visually show the growth of the character, but what does it actually symbolize? Well, the lore says that they started to use it in the year 738 BBY. This year saw an event that the Republic called the Mandalorian Excision. In Mandoa it was called Dralhan, or the Annihilation. This is where the Republic invaded Mandalore and bombed the world into submission, turning it from a lush, beautiful world into these white sand deserts. As Darth Bane brought an end to the Sith Empire in 1000 BBY, the Republic thought that they could finally have peace if they could just destroy the war-loving Mandalorians. They knew that this would also require a cultural shift, and so the Republic installed a transitional government over Mandalorian space. And I happen to be a believer of a Mando conspiracy theory that states that the Republic created and supported the party that would come to be known as the New Mandalorians. These peace-loving Mandalorians wanted to partake in the Republic system, and rework the entire economy away from supporting the Mandalorian war machine. Mandalorian suits of armor were banned on Mandalore itself, which for them was akin to giving up their religion, as maintaining the armor was something that was kept up in the canons of honor. That all gets really complex and interesting, but we do cover it in complete detail in our documentary-length video. But basically, those who refused to give up these ancient traditions were exiled to the moon Concordia. Those Mandos did keep the armor tradition, and as they designed a new iteration, they incorporated this newly circulating symbol of the undying Mandalorian spirit. The Republic, Jedi, and Sith had all conspired to destroy the Mandoade. Now their world was reduced to a desert wasteland, but yet they still survived. But even more important for the culture is that the peaceful Mandalorians and those still keeping up the warlike traditions both utilized this symbol. No matter where you were on the peace-war continuum, all wanted to remember the time that their world was destroyed. This symbol is everywhere on Mandalore, even hundreds of years later under Duchess Satine. It's in abstract shapes that decorate the public areas, incorporated into clothing of both officials and civilians, influence the look of security, and it's even on their vehicles. But that doesn't mean that they both saw it the same way. To the new Mandos, it may be a symbol of how the war-loving traditions failed them, a reminder that for all their martial strength, they were rolled over by the Republic. But to the traditional Mandos, they see it as an event that they should never forget, an attack that they should never forgive, and that Mandalorians can only count on themselves, and prepare for the day that they can get revenge. That their heart was undefeated, made from one of the hardest materials in the galaxy, Beskar, Mandalorian iron. So now that you know the backstory of this ubiquitous symbol, I hope you think of the Dralhan, the Annihilation, every time you see this Iron Heart. And if you want to learn that complete story, be sure to click on the card. I know I'm interested in seeing how the Mandalorian Excision will be explored more in canon material. But most important of all, remember, the Mandalorians will always remember, and the Force will be with you, always. What's up, Meta Nerds? This breakdown of the Kandosii-type dreadnought will take us back to the Old Republic era, a time when the Mandalorian fleets were at their peak strength, seeing its complement, armament, and a ton more, as well as how its legacy would affect the galaxy for thousands of years. It was created by various Mandalorian manufacturers, but would not have included the famed Mandel motors, since that most famous manufacturer was not even a millennia old by the time of the Battle of Yavin. Sounds funny to consider them a young company, but for reference, Rendili Hyperworks and Kuat Drive Yards were making major warships for the Republic for at least 4,000 years. And its manufacturer isn't some Mandalorian secret, but even they lost all accounts of this due to their fracturing from the Mandalorian Wars on, from 3,976 BBY up to what we see in the post-Imperial era with Bo-Katan and Din Djarin. These people would lose a lot of their history to infighting, which in a twisted way shows just how important other aspects were to their culture, since the history and traditions that do survive had to survive countless forces pulling them apart. And yet things like their armor, Great Dragon symbolism, and Mandoa language were cherished enough to remember and keep alive. Which really says something, because what we do know of the manufacturer is that though they forgot which of the Mando companies produced the Kandosii, they proudly remember that they stole this tech from the Fenalar species. a history that includes their extermination by the Mandalorian Crusaders around 6,700 BBY. The Fenelar were a highly advanced people that produced great dreadnoughts and armor. This armor was made of frick, which was a lightsaber and blaster-resistant rare material, in a class shared only with Cortosis and Beskar. They weren't claiming to be the geniuses that designed it, but were proud that they conquered these people, seizing their warships and Jedi-stopping armor, before exterminating them and incorporating these designs the nerd species developed into their more powerful and thus divinely supported civilization. Their war god smiled as fittingly this line of Mando-produced dreadnoughts based off this conquered tech would be named the Kandosii, meaning indomitable or ruthless in the Mandawade language. It is unclear how much of this design was uniquely developed by the Mando engineers over the years, but the dreadnought that would introduce itself to the Old Republic and Sith factions was this model, which cost 200 million credits. And since inflation seems non-existent in the galaxy far, far away, you can compare that cost with later ships like the Imperial and Venator Star Destroyers, showing something similar to the Keldabe, the effects of economy at scale seen in Kuat drive yards being able to produce something cheaper and in most ways better. At a length of 1,360 meters, or about 0.85 miles, it was right in between a Venator and Imperial, and more than 4 times the Old Republic Hammerhead. The height is about 680 meters, or 0.42 miles, making it about 2 Zillo beasts taller than an ISD, while at a width of 397 meters, or a quarter mile, it was more than twice the Hammerhead, while being thinner than both Kuat craft. With its Class 2 hyperdrive rating, it was on par with most capital ships across all eras, with the faster Class 1 being an exception, and it did have a backup Class 9. In the Keldabe, we saw a rare shield leeching technology, and the Mandos sure do like to keep their shields interesting, with this dreadnought having double-layered deflector shields. As good as that sounds, there must be a reason we don't see this tech even in Mon Calamari designs, which are usually considered to have the best shielding devices out there. It reminds me more of the cheaper, improvised type of armor you might find, like when real-world troops add sandbags or cages to stop penetration from explosive devices. No other manufacturer would use this double shield method, they would just make the shield stronger, and there would be the issue of shield projectors feeding into each other, so to make this work there's likely 2 different systems. Don't get me wrong, I think it's genius and a simple, practical solution, since 2 different types of shield projectors meant that you could hope that outer layer could be replaced before the final layer was defeated. But just like how no manufacturer is sending out troop carriers with sandbags and body armor stacked on top, that's something the troops developed from their battlefield experience, I think the Mandalorians improvised this double shield from their non-stop campaigns throughout the galaxy, and saw that it did actually work. The whole plating comes from a rare source, the company Biblos drive yards, which of all things would be most known for the G-1A starfighter used by Zuckuss. This company was great for developing cloaking technology, but not at the capital ship scale. Its armament consisted of 5 heavy turbolaser batteries, 4 point defense medium ion cannons, and 2 triple laser point defense laser cannons, with a pair of super heavy concussion missile batteries, and a total of 120 missiles on board, as well as 2 tractor beam batteries. When compared to the Clone Wars era on, the Kandosii is a bit light, but it really isn't too far behind, especially considering that they went all in on the missiles, having about twice that of the Venator, while the ISD had none. The Imperial craft focused on cannons and tractor beams, better for capturing sneaky rebel ships, but the ancient Mandawade were willing to completely destroy anything in their path, knowing that if they did wish to take an enemy alive, they could send out their complement of 128 Devab-type starfighters to neutralize the engines and guns of an enemy ship, and send over boarding crews via the 8 Shadlar-type trooper ships, while the number of Basilisk war droids was described simply as numerous. The Devab was your standard fighter, but the Shadlar was this horrifying spider that could dig on or crawl across your space station or capital ship, and like a mama spider full of eggs on her back, this thing could unleash a swarm of 800 troops. That means that each carried more than an entire clone battalion. That's a total of 6,400 jetpack sporting Mandalorians that could be moved from the Kandosii to any target in a single wave. And of course, they could shuttle back and forth during major offensives, since there was a total of 30,000 troops on board each Kandosii. So all of them could be transported with these 8 Shadlars, making 5 trips each, meaning you could be resupplying certain areas, or choosing 40 different targets to drop more than a battalion on, exiting via these hangars below on some models, while others have it on these long sections up top, open on each end. The difference can easily be explained as different variants over the years, and either form provides great cover and rapid deployment, as you can't hit them as they exit when facing dead on, and when on the ventral side they could peel out each way or continue straight back to circle around, or just drop down right on top of the target, using the massive double-shielded Kandosii to escort them all the way up, absorbing whatever defenses the enemy might have, and unleashing the fighters and transports to make that final short trip down to the surface of the planet, station, or ship. You can see why when all of this is considered, it's not underpowered at all. And we haven't even looked at how effective the super heavy concussion missile batteries are. We'll see that when we look at the history. The crew was 10,000 in number, so a total of 40k is about 4 times the Venator, but a lot closer to the ISD. And since these Mandos were used to more Spartan quarters, you could pack them in a lot closer. And you can see why the Mandalorians of this era, with proper militaries and huge numbers, were such an overwhelming force for most of the galaxy. While the cargo capacity of 45,000 tons meant every single Mando on board could have a whole can-do back to enjoy for the length of the campaign. The only obvious issue to point out is that some of these guns are blocked by its own structures, reducing some of the forward-facing fire from the cannons, but they were expecting to make this up with the barrage of missiles coming from the bow and this entire lower protruding superstructure. These cannons are canted and could fire forward and back, while you might expect these ones up top to be ion weaponry, with the point defense lasers and anti-starfighter roll scattered across various surfaces. As for their history, the Mandalorian Wars would bring the full might of their fleets against the Republic in 3964 BBY, starting with the Battle of Vanquo. But many point to the Crusader raids that started in 3976 and kept ramping up until they had to be opposed by the Jedi-led Republic military. Their fleets were anchored by the powerful Kandosiis, along with the Krymud-type battleship, Jahave-Ir-type assault ship, dungeon ships, Q-carriers, and Taroch-type gunships. These were used to blitz Vanquo, easily overwhelming them with these powerful capital ships and an insane number of troops that could be rapidly transported. And then this tactic was seen on Tarsis, though this fight was more difficult, requiring a 3-pronged defensive that eventually did result in a valuable addition to the growing empire of Mandalore the Ultimate. His Neo-Crusaders were operating from an HQ established on the frozen world of Jebel, and they quickly set sights on Sirocco. This world had full member status in the Republic, and this battle would forever change the relationship between the Mandalorians and the rest of the galactic community. The Jedi and Republic forces would lead Battle Group Sirocco from the Inexpugnable-class tactical command ship named Courageous, forming a blockade with Hammerheads, Forays, and Aurok starfighters. When the Mando force did pop out of hyperspace, confirming their intel, they saw that the Kandosiis immediately opened with a full volley of missiles. All power was directed to the forward shields, but they showed a previously unknown capability. As the missiles raced toward the Republic capital ship, they abruptly changed direction and within seconds were striking the surface of Sirocco. Their plan was to cut off all the ground reinforcements, as the Republic was planning to cycle out forces in the blockade as the space battle raged on. They saw the mushroom clouds forming all across the planet. These were not conventional weapons, but nuclear warheads that had turned the Republic bases and major cities into massive glass craters. Only 8 ships would be able to make it off-world and evacuate the fallout. As the battle continued, the Republic fleet would be pursued into deep space, and the Mandalorian Neo-Crusaders showed just how well they had perfected ship boarding. Going right for the head, the flagship of Admiral Karath was swarmed by Mando transports, and now close-quarters combat skills would determine the outcome of this first official battle between these two powerful factions. The Courageous was still trying to flee, as the Mandos were clearing decks, and the crew was making desperate attempts to get away via escape pods. Karath tried to make a last stand with Jedi allies and elite troops, but eventually they were surrounded in the brig. Luckily for them, their Jedi helped use the Force to create an opening, and these last defenders narrowly escaped with their lives. With this overwhelming victory motivating them, the Mandalorians would push all the way to the core and strike fear into all the elites on Coruscant, the ancient and original homeworld of the Mandalorian ancestors. But eventually, the might of this ship would have to be turned against their own HQ on Jebel, when Cassus Fett was faced with stopping the Rakul Plague, a disease engineered by an ancient Sith Lord Karnus Mur. It would kill over 60 million on Taurus and 1 million Mandalorians on Jebel before Fett gave the order to glass this world and contain the plague. With the bombardment of nukes and the resulting fallout, this threat to the Mandos was finally stopped. Over the next 3,000 years, the Mandalorians' grasp on the galaxy would slowly fade, due to responses by the Jedi, Republic, and betrayals from their Sith allies, but mostly from the fracturing within their own clans, something they would never fully recover from. And while the might of the Mando fleets was gone, the memory of the Kandosii would go on to influence the Dreadnought-class heavy cruiser, manufactured by their old enemy, Rendili, but also the Mandel Motors creation, the Crusader-class corvette. As for behind-the-scenes facts, according to the Knights of the Old Republic campaign guide, a notable flaw in their design was that their hyperspace navigation systems could be crippled by a strategically placed charge in the rear, which must have been tricky to pull off when the double shields were activated. There's a rich modding community out there that involves this craft, and even a fan-made Kandosii 2. It's really interesting. If you want to check it out, links to all these sources are in the description, while most of this info comes from the Knights of the Old Republic comic series, Essential Guide to Warfare, and Dreadnoughts of Rendili. Likes, comments, and shares are the best way to help me out. Subscribe if you want to see more. But most important of all, Remember, the greatest source of nightmare fuel in the galaxy is nuclear-powered Mandos, and the Force will be with you. Always.
Tras viva marga, robomanir gatimo.
Tireless.
Sabira Adhir Nara Empire Kippin. Empire.
What's up, nerds? In this video, we'll be breaking down the Quorin species. Everything from their planet, biology, culture, history, and impact on the galaxy. In the Outer Rim's Calamari sector lies a gleaming bluish-white orb known to its inhabitants as Dak. This ocean-covered planet, also called Mon Cala or Mon Calamari by human explorers from the Galactic Republic, dazzles viewers with its beauty from space. The diverse world is home to a wealth of sentient species: the Mon Calamari, the Quorin, the Moapa, the Amphihydrus, and the Whalodons, and the world would come to have a staggering population of 27.5 billion Mon Calamari and Quorin. Its shimmering oceans stretch uninterrupted save for a few scattered reefs and atolls, creating a vast aquatic paradise, with 398 day years and each day lasting 21 hours. The world is strategically positioned on the Overic, Griplic, and the Giblim route, two significant hyperlanes, allowing the planet to serve as a crucial waypoint in the galaxy. The Quorin, with their squid-like heads and leathery skin, were amphibious humanoids resembling cephalopods. Their faces featured at least 4 tentacles, which they used to handle food. They had small mouths with 2 sharp teeth on either side of a long, thin tongue between them. From each side of their face extended 2 long protrusions containing structures for hearing, serving the same role as ears. They had holes in their neck for breathing and 2 sac-like organs hanging from the back of their heads. Quorin could change their skin color during mating rituals. Most had orange skin, though rare individuals displayed gray-green, pink, or purple hues. They all possess shimmering turquoise blue eyes, and as aquatic beings they needed to keep their skin moist to survive, though the ones with claws required less moisture. And they lived for about 79 standard years and stood around 1.7 meters, 5 feet 7 inches tall, which is right around most humanoids. There were 3 types of Quorin distinguished by their hands. Some had fingers with suction cups, either 3 or 5, while others had thick fingers without suction cups but had those sharp claws. Whether these differences indicated distinct subspecies is unclear. Having evolved in the depths of Mon Calamari, the Quorin were naturally adapted to the high pressures of their underwater world. They could dive to depths of 300 meters without needing any breathing or pressure apparatus. However, ascending from the depths of 50 meters or more required careful decompression, a process that took as much time as they had spent below. This allowed their bodies to adjust to the lower pressure near the surface. The Quorin were a proud and self-centered species, often bordering on xenophobia, which aligned with their isolationist tendencies. They viewed humans as crude and found Galactic Basic, the common language, to be cumbersome and unsuitable for speech. Instead, they preferred their native language, using it far more frequently than the Mon Calamari, who often spoke Basic to interact with Offworlders, which is also something the Quorin rarely did. In sharp contrast with their neighbors, the Quorin were conservative and practical thinkers. The Mon Calamari looked toward the future and explored the galaxy. The Quorin were deeply rooted in their traditions, remembering their past, and this conservative nature made them more isolationist, preferring to stay in the ocean depths of their homeworld. Yet eventually some Quorin did venture out, following Mon Calamari, and for some reason settled around the career of business managers and accountants. While the Mon Calamari excelled in manufacturing starships and their orbital shipyards, the Quorin worked diligently to mine metal ore from the ocean's deepest parts. They also played a crucial role in building the massive floating cities for the Mon Calamari. While most of their neighbors lived on the scattered islands of Dak or in the upper levels of these floating cities, the Quorin preferred the darkness of the deep ocean. They built their own cities beneath the waves or lived in the lower levels of the cities, which stretched far below the surface. Though you might see some parallels there with Coruscant, the Quorin really were more comfortable in the dark depths, contrasting sharply with the light-loving Mon Calamari. Something many species would come to moralize, as most of the spacefaring races across the galaxy evolved on their surface, and so at least the Mon Calamari were close to that, and there was a natural fear of creatures that wanted to dwell in the darkness below. The Quorin shared their deep-sea home with other fascinating species, including the Whalodons, the Moapa, and the enigmatic Knowledge Bank. In their local language called the Pukaucau, they were like sentient mollusk supercomputers that recorded every event that happened in the oceans, and then could communicate with other species via telepathy. It's one of the strangest creatures in the entire galaxy, and one of the Quorin's deep underwater neighbors. In ancient times, the Quorin had a warrior caste known as the Kokad, who were charged with protecting their people from the many dangerous sea creatures that inhabited their world. And so you can see these are people that are truly shaped by the high-pressure depths of Dak's oceans. Circa 4500 BBY, the Quorin encountered the Mon Calamari for the first time. Their neighbors residing in the shallower parts of the ocean were met with suspicion and hostility from the Quorin, who attacked them first, sparking what would seem like a never-ending feud. Despite being less aggressive, the Mon Calamari possessed superior technology and ultimately emerged victorious. They chose not to pursue further conflict, fearing it would lead to the Quorin's extinction. As the Quorin recovered from the war, the Mon Calamari embarked on a bold cultural experiment to prevent future conflicts. They captured hundreds of young Quorin and immersed them in Mon Calamari civilization, teaching them arts, sciences, and ethics, and once fully educated, these young Quorin were released back to their communities. This led to a rift within Quorin society. The elder generations distrusted the younger ones, viewing them as brainwashed usurpers, while the youth saw their elders as uneducated barbarians. Eventually, the educated youth assumed control, leading to a fragile peace that lasted for centuries. Although tensions occasionally resurfaced as new generations of Quorin reverted to traditional values, the overall relationship between the two species remained stable. As peace settled, many Quorins began venturing off-planet, finding roles as business managers and accountants. They spread across the galaxy, reaching as far as Taurus, Telos IV, and Nar Shaddaa. Some Quorin even joined the Exchange, bringing their efficacy to the criminal syndicate. During the New Sith Wars, Quorin found themselves on both sides of the conflict, fighting in both the Army of Light and the Brotherhood of Darkness. And this turbulent period showcased the Quorin's complex nature and adaptability. Though having a preference for isolation, dwelling alone in the darkness, when they engaged with the galaxy at large, they did excel. But around 500 years before the Battle of Naboo, a very significant event further shaped Quorin history. Hugo Barton, seeking amphibian fishermen for a new settlement in Lamorid, enticed impoverished Mon Calamari in Quorin with promises of untouched seas and a fresh start. Upon arrival, however, these hopeful settlers were forced into slave labor and confined to crowded conditions. The long-standing animosity between Mon Calamari and Quorin quickly escalated into violence, leading to the creation of a Quorin colony called the Shoals, and the formation of at least one Quorin swoop gang. Later, Mon Calamari joined the Galactic Republic, gaining representation in the Senate. And for at least the last decade of the Old Republic, Mon Calamari's government and its representation in the Galactic Senate were shared between the Mon Calamari and Quorin. This partnership highlighted the ongoing but fragile coexistence of these two species. Just before the Clone Wars, a scandal involving Quorin Senator TKs shook the Calamari sector. TKs allowed Thalassian slavers to operate within the sector, a decision that, when eventually exposed, led to his house arrest. And under immense pressure, TKs defected to the Confederacy of Independent Systems, taking many of his people with him. This move was highly controversial and sparked opposition from many citizens on Dak, and TKs in response formed the Quorin Isolation League, and with reinforcements from the CIS, moved against the Mon Calamari Council, the ruling legislative body of Dak. The Republic supported the Mon Calamari and the loyal Quorin in this conflict, further deepening the divisions on the planet. A civil war erupted on Dak, pitting the Republic loyalist Mon Calamari Knights and Republic forces against the Quorin Isolation League and the separatist-aligned Mon Calamari led by Mirai. After numerous skirmishes, the Republic triumphed over the Quorin Isolation League in the decisive Battle of Mon Calamari. Following the conflict, new accords were signed, and pro-Republic senators Tundra Dalmia and Mina Tills, a Mon Calamari, jointly represented Dak in the Senate. However, not all Quorin were satisfied with this resolution. The remnants of the Quorin Isolation League formed the Free Dak Volunteers Engineering Corps, an organization primarily composed of Quorin exiles on separatist worlds like Mintuine and Pemant. They continued to support the CIS by manufacturing many of its warships, including the Providence-class, Requisite, and Subjugator-class heavy cruiser. And it's because of this enormous contribution to the CIS that many in the Republic were desperate to strike back somehow. This allegiance led to Quorins being among the species deported from Coruscant by Tanin Praji, under the influence of the Human Suppressionist Commission for the Protection of the Republic. Around 21 BBY, a second battle for control of Mon Calamari ensued when the Quorin, backed by the CIS, attempted to seize the Calamari system. The Jedi Order intervened, bringing reinforcements from the Grand Army of the Republic and the Gungan Grand Army. Despite their efforts, Separatist Commander Riff Tamsin, of the Carcharodon species, proved to be a formidable foe. His tactics led to the capture of all Republic forces except Ahsoka Tano and Prince Lichar, the heir to the Mon Calamari throne. Quorin leader No Sarai soon realized that Tamsin and Count Dooku intended to take Dak for themselves, rather than for the Quorin people. And seeing the betrayal, he would re-ally with the Republic, and together they successfully routed the Separatists, restoring a precarious peace to Dak. This both showed how weak this world was when these two species were split against each other, but also how powerful they could be when allied. Mon Calamari faced a brutal invasion by Imperial forces. The humanocentric Imperials viewed the people of Dak, particularly the industrious Mon Calamari, as high-quality slaves to fuel the Imperial war machine. Also, the planet's senators had signed the Petition of 2000, an anti-Palpatine document, which further incited the Emperor's wrath. Some reports suggest that Quorin agents, driven by their deep-seated animosity toward the Mon Calamari, sabotaged the planetary shields just before the Imperial attack, leading to a swift and decisive victory for the Empire. Segor Tells, a prominent Quorin leader, did later confess to being one of these saboteurs. Despite some Quorin initially complying with the Empire, both Quorin and Mon Calamari were enslaved. The Quorin's enslavement may have been a consequence of their previous alliance with the Confederacy, while Mon Calamari's attempts at passive resistance led to harsh reprisals. In a brutal show of force, Emperor Palpatine ordered the destruction of 3 major Mon Calamari cities, turning these massive works of art, the chandelier cities of the sea, into debris scattered across the seabed. However, the oppression eventually united the Quorin and Mon Calamari against their common enemy. Ironically, Segor Tells, who had once facilitated the Imperial conquest, became a key figure in rallying the Quorin to resist the Empire, and together these two species succeeded in driving the imps off Dak. Following the liberation of Mon Calamari, many Quorin chose to distance themselves from the Rebel Alliance and its successor, the New Republic. Fearing further Imperial reprisals, numerous Quorins left Mon Calamari for other worlds, seeking safety and a fresh start away from the conflicts that plagued their homeworld. After the reborn Palpatine's assault on Dak in 10 ABY, the Quorin threatened to leave in a mass exodus, though it remains unclear how many actually did. And over time, many Quorin dispersed throughout the galaxy, finding new homes on various worlds. Those who remained on Mon Calamari continued to show loyalty to their people, and relationships began to blossom between the Quorin and the Mon Calamari. One notable example was the romantic relationship between the male Quorin Rin Vakal and the Mon Calamari female Ibtisam, both elite members of Rogue Squadron. Around 9 ABY, we see Captain Shugoth, who we can see has this specialized device to make her feel like she's back at home, and she fell in love with a Mon Calamari prince, eloping on the captain's starship before being tracked down by the Mandalorian mercenaries led by Axe Wolves. During the Yuuzhan Vong War, a Quorin named Po represented Dak alongside the Mon Calamari Grand Marab. Following the loss of Coruscant to the Yuuzhan Vong, Po attempted to usurp the New Republic presidency, but failed and eventually joined the Elysian Republic on Elysia. Meanwhile, Grand Marab remained loyal and continued to represent Mon Calamari in the Senate of the Galactic Alliance. By 130 ABY, after the Sith Imperial War and the rise of Darth Krayt as Galactic Emperor, the Quorin gained significant influence as members of the new Sith Order, with some holding high positions in the government of Dak. 2 prominent Quorin Sith Lords were Darth Malevel and Darth Azard, and following the Battle of Mon Calamari, the Quorin were initially spared from Emperor Krayt's decree to execute 10% of Dak's population, which included the members of the Mon Calamari Council. However, Quorin who opposed these orders were executed as well. When the genocide reached a standstill, the destruction of Vol Isen's Sea Leviathan, Darth Warlock, Krayt's successor, ordered the execution of the Final Protocol, which would poison Dak's oceans and render the planet uninhabitable within 7 days. When Darth Azard inquired about the Quorin, who had collaborated with the Sith Empire, Warlock coldly responded that the Quorin would be allowed to leave the planet, but without any Imperial assistance. As the galaxy learned of the Final Protocol, Regent Morlish Veed faced backlash from Quorin ministers, having to answer for the Sith's actions. And during the evacuation of Dak, organized by Admiral Gar Stasi of the Galactic Alliance Remnant, a Quorin delegation demanded that their species receive greater priority in the evacuation efforts over the Whaladons and Mawapa. But given the Quorin's collaboration with the Empire, Admiral Stasi decreed that they would only be allocated every 10th ship in the evacuation fleet, and warned that those attempting to board other ships would be shot. Following the downfall of the One Sith, the galaxy saw the Sith retreat into the shadows as a new power rose on Coruscant. The Galactic Federation Triumvirate, composed of the Fel Empire, the Jedi Order, and the Galactic Alliance, took the reins of leadership. In 138 ABY, a sinister scheme unfolded as numerous Quorin and Mon Calamari were lured back to Dak with the promises of a renewed world. Instead, they found themselves ensnared by a pirate syndicate led by the rogue Sith Darth Luft. Forced into slavery, they toiled to build a fleet of ships, while their children and elderly relatives were held hostage. These pirates ruled with cruelty, meting out beatings and abuse. Amid all this turmoil, a Quorin named Tarkin struck up an unlikely friendship with a Mon Calamari environmental engineer named Lurin. Their alliance caught the attention of Imperial Knight Jao Assam and junk dealer Anaya Solo. Realizing the dire situation, Assam and Solo quickly relayed the grim news to the triumvirate authorities on Coruscant. The murder of Tarkin by Darth Luft became the catalyst for a desperate uprising. United in their suffering, the Quorin and Mon Calamari joined forces to rebel against their captors. This revolt coincided with a coordinated attack by the Galactic Triumvirate, led by Admiral Stasi and the Imperial Knight Yalta Val. In the ensuing battle, the enslaved workers were freed, and the pirates were captured. Darth Luft met his end in a fierce duel with Jao Assam. In the aftermath, the liberated Quorin and Mon Calamari found refuge in a specially prepared space station, its chambers flooded with water to replicate their aquatic home. This gesture by Admiral Stasi created a haven for the former slaves. As a powerful symbol of reconciliation and unity, Tarkin's son Tillin was taken in by Aunt Lun, blending their families and the future of these two species, with all hoping that they would break the cycle of these two fish folk fighting against each other, and together they could build a strong future for both species. That's it for the breakdown, and as for behind the scenes facts, Tessic ended up in the court of Jabba the Hutt after fleeing Dak during the Imperial invasion, and though he survived the destruction of the sail barge, his brain was forcibly removed from his body by the Ba'omar monks, placing him in that unfathomable, hellish existence of the brain in the spider jar. If you want to learn more, a lot of this comes from the Essential Guide to Alien Species, the Atlas, and the Galactic Campaign Guide. Please hit that like button, it's the best way to help me out. Subscribe to see more, and check out these videos, I'm sure you'll like them. But most important of all, remember, if you did judge the species that dwelled in darkness, well, historically speaking, you'd be right about every time. And the Force will be with you. Always. What's up, Meta Nerds? This video is all about a vessel found only in the shadiest parts of the galaxy, the Weekway pirate ship. It is unclear who manufactured it, or by what cost, but by looking at the engine array, I'd say there are some similarities with Corellian Engineering Corporation. But this ship does have wings that are tipped with laser cannons that can open up via an S-foil, similar to Incom Corporation designs like the ARC-170 and the X-Wing. To get its size, I think we can compare it to the CR-90. The engines on a CR-90 are around 43 meters long, so if we say that this section of the pirate ship was also 43 meters, then the total length would be 104 meters or 341 feet. That's 2/3 the length of the CR-90, and less than 1/3 of the Corona-class, aka the Pirate Saucer mothership. At 156 meters or 512 feet wide, it was nearly half the diameter of the saucer, and more than 8 ARC-170s across. As for its height, it is a bit hard to tell, but much taller than an AT-ST, perhaps even taller than an AT-AT, so somewhere around 22 meters or 72 feet. But that's with its wings closed. By taking the length of the wing in relation to its width and doubling it, then the height with these wings split open would be about 76 meters or 249 feet. That's nearly 4 sandcrawlers tall, more than twice the height of the CR-90. If a Weekway raiding party ever came to Earth, it would be about 1.5 Boeing 747s long, 1.5 football fields wide, and with the wing split, taller than a 24-story building. Those 6 thrusters seem to have given it a top atmospheric speed similar to most cargo ships, so something around 800 kilometers per hour or 497 miles per hour. And it does appear that its intended role was simply as a cargo vessel. You can see that the interior space is designed for cargo, and you can see that the cockpit is located on top of this ship instead of at the front of the vessel, better for getting a view of loading docks and spaceports. These protrusions up front would most likely be the tractor beam emitters, perfectly placed to assist in the seamless docking or transfer of cargo, and is in the same position as a lot of other cargo haulers. But I said that was its intended role because the Weekway pirate gangs came up with a more original use for it.
Oh, goodness gracious me!
Each of these wings had voluminous cargo bays, with a loading elevator right in the center of it. But to the eyes of these pirates, it looked more like a fight pit. Inside the hexagon, the pirates would entertain themselves by pitting droids against each other in a fight to the digital death. Some crowd favorites were customized for fighting, but when the competition was sparse, they could always throw in some random droids they scavenged just to watch them get torn to bits or melted to slag. These floating droid gladiator rings would become a hotspot for gambling, as this style of fighting was common across the galaxy. That pair of laser cannons and potentially 4 torpedo tubes could be great when raiding unsuspecting merchant vessels, but the thin hull armor and weak or non-existent shields made it quick work for military vessels. When Grievous came upon the Marauder, he interrupted a deathmatch by deciding to use the ship as target practice. The first turbolaser shot blew an enormous hole in the vessel, ripping many of the crew and droids out into space. Subsequent shots were placed on the engine array, and you can see this blue wave of energy marking the destruction of their generators and Tabana gas reserves. It is likely that this particular ship was reduced to space dust, but there are countless models like it across the galaxy. As you would expect, whenever the Weekway pirates wanted to sell off their booty, or buy some entertainment or spices, they would have to set down on some seedy worlds. Many are seen on Zygeria, most likely aiding in the transport and capture of slaves, and maybe stopping to catch a deathmatch that involved organic combatants. Many are also seen on the homeworld of the pike species, Obadiah, assisting them in their spice trade, and I'm sure taking downtime to spend ill-gotten credits in the best spice den the port city had to offer. It is unclear how many Weekway pirate ships still roam the galaxy, but it is interesting to consider that they may have helped in the organization of Rinriven Dai. He was the Weekway crime boss that was able to make his species synonymous with organized crime, filling the void left when the New Republic crushed the Hutt cartels. So that's it for its history, and the only behind-the-scenes facts is that it first appeared in the episode Nomad Droids in Season 4 of the Clone Wars TV show. It is unclear what this underside red window is for, but it's pretty cool that it looks like a TIE fighter wing or the CIS logo. Perhaps this area would be manned by a co-pilot or loading expert that could look out on the loading docks and move around crates with the tractor beam. But that's it for the Weekway pirate ship. But most important of all, remember, the first rule about Weekway Droid Fight Club is bet on the droid with flamethrower hands. And the Force will be with you. Always. What's up, Meta Nerds? This video is all about the Reborn Emperor's superweapon, the Galaxy Gun. You can say a lot of bad things about Palpatine, ranging from remarks about his lack of skincare products to having murdered his entire family, but you can never say the man didn't plan ahead. One example is that the Emperor made sure that his throne room was one of the only rooms on the Death Star to have handrails, but even this preventative measure did not save him. Luckily though, having risen to power during an event known as the Clone Wars, Palpatine knew a thing or two about cloning. In case someone could find a way to lift him over these rails and drop him into a big tube, Palpatine made sure he had plenty of backup bodies to take over. During his reign, the Emperor would conduct essence transfers on multiple clone replicas of himself, making them nearly perfect copies. When the Emperor died, one of these clones started to rebuild the Empire. Palpatine's throne world was on Biss, a highly secured planet located in the deep core. After many years of planning, the Emperor ensured that this site could quickly pump out new Star Destroyers. The resulting Biss defense fleet was created back in 19 BBY, the final year of the Clone Wars. During its early years, this fleet protected the Super Star Destroyer prototype, but it had remained relatively obscure and was able to keep off the New Republic's radar. The Reborn Emperor added to the Biss defense fleet, including the Secutor-class, Vengeance-class dreadnoughts, and at least one Bellator, making it a rival to the best of the New Republic fleets. But Palpatine's love of super weapons was definitely transferred into these clones as well, resulting in the production of the Galaxy Gun. This massive cannon was completed in 10 ABY and cost an estimated 300 billion credits. That is the equivalent to 2,000 Imperial Star Destroyers or 5 million TIE Fighters. This massive superweapon was 7,250 meters or 4.5 miles long. This makes it about 4.5 Imperial Star Destroyers, but still less than half the length of the Executor-class Super Star Destroyer. At 1,217.5 meters, or 0.75 miles tall, it was 2.5 times the height of the ISD, 12 Zillo Beasts, or equal to 52 AT-ATs. If the Galaxy Gun were to show up on Earth, it would stretch from the tip of Manhattan at Battery Park up to the Empire State Building, or nearly 4 times the Nimitz-class aircraft carrier. And it would be about the height of the Burj Khalifa, plus the Empire State Building. If we take a look at this schematic, we see that the sublight engines are located at the rear, while the hyperdrive is located in this area. There are some conflicting sources on the hyperdrive class, with some stating that it's a Class 6, making it slower than almost any other ship, while others state that it's a Class 0.75, making it faster than almost every other ship, and putting it into the range of custom ships used by criminals. Automated turbolasers surrounded this whole engine array, but this area also houses the command station, followed by the crew station. This next area contains the computers used to make this weapon accurate, then the main reactor. All of the missiles were located here, and in this image you can see how and where they were loaded, with this observation deck located right here. This enormous barrel contained a propulsion accelerator and a final stage energizer, which were crucial for making this a genuine superweapon. It fired what were called intelligent projectiles, since they could be accelerated to the right degree to just destroy a city, region, or entire planet with its particle disintegrator warhead. To make it even worse, these rounds could travel through hyperspace and emerge anywhere in the galaxy. When fired at full power, these particle disintegrator warheads started a nuclear reaction that chained to each connected atom until the entire planet was consumed. The first celestial body to get this treatment was the Pinnacle Moon in Hutt space, selected because it contained an important New Republic base. The resulting commando squad that was sent to eliminate this superweapon was easily blown apart by the BiS defense fleet. Many other worlds were destroyed, allowing Palpatine to retake parts of the inner and outer rim. Then the New Republic learned that it had some features that made it even more terrifying, with the destruction of Nespis 8 showing that the warheads themselves were covered in armor strong enough to prevent them from being shot down, and then it was shown that they were accurate enough to target ships, seen in the loss of the Pelagia that took the lives of 100,000 troops on board. It wasn't until Luke was able to kill the reborn Emperor that the true hero R2-D2 was able to save the galaxy again, by sending the Eclipse 2 on a crash course to smash into this superweapon. The Eclipse 2 was itself also considered a superweapon, so in this one incident, the New Republic now had the upper hand. Perhaps guided by the mysterious hand of the Force, one of the missiles was armed and expelled from the craft right before the galaxy gun's destruction. This warhead was caught in the gravitational pull of BiS, bringing the nuke to the surface and consuming the Emperor's throne world. So that's it for its history, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. When the gun was fired, hyperwave transmission probes followed the missile so that Palpatine could view the effects of this weapon. More than a decade later, Luke would wonder if destroying this gun was a mistake, as it would have easily repelled the Yuuzhan Vong fleets. And this isn't confirmed, but I think we can deduce that it took half an hour to energize, reload, and fire this weapon when a failed missile lodged itself into a New Republic vessel. And a bit of what I think is a joke for the reader is when Palpatine says about this gun, "It's a wonder we didn't think of it decades ago." This has to be a reference to the fact that Star Wars fans always point out how inefficient the Death Star was, especially when compared to the capabilities seen in the expanded universe. And this weapon was first introduced in the comic Dark Empire 2 and finished in Empire's End. Other information was added via the new Essential Guide to Weapons and Technology and the Essential Atlas. So that's it for the Galaxy Gun. But most important of all, remember, R2-D2 really needs to be considered a super weapon at this point. And the Force will be with you, always. What's up, Meta-Nerds? This video is all about the simply named stealth ship used by the Republic during the Clone Wars. It was developed by Sienar Design Systems, a subsidiary of Republic Sienar Systems, the people that developed the Star Courier, aka the Sith Infiltrator. Darth Sidious himself secretly commissioned Wraith Sienar, who was instructed to ensure this project's secrecy. This ship would be gifted to Darth Maul, who named it the Scimitar, and Sienar's company would be integrally tied to the Empire from then on out. It would later change its name to Sienar Fleet Systems, and provide Sidious with a fleet of countless TIE fighters. Just a few years after the stealth ship was produced, the Republic Senate actually forced Sienar Design Systems to shut down after numerable account and facility irregulations were discovered. This may in part explain why the project was not continued. But let's take a look at the stealth ship to see where everything was and how it all worked. The cockpit was up here, with the front of this ship coming to this sharp point. It had a unique looking split design window, and if we take a look inside of the cockpit, we can see that a steep ramp leads up to the seats for the pilot and co-pilot. This area is adorned with tons of buttons and data screens, as well as having a holo transmitter located right on the dash. If we look down the length of this ship, we can see that it was streamlined for cargo delivery. Essentially a perfect blockade breaker, as its stealth measures allowed it to get past even the largest blockade fleets without a fight, and deliver a massive amount of goods. It is even designed for rapid dispersion of cargo, as you can see in this shot that at least multiple side panels, if not all of them, can be lifted and extend ramps so that your forces on-world can quickly take cargo off. That may be part of why it has this long pencil shape, instead of looking like a bulky freighter, as if you only had one main cargo door, you would have people bottling up or having to form a chain, instead of just running up to the sides. The stealth ship had a 10-man crew who sat at data stations which collected info from the 2 radar dishes and a vast array of other sensing equipment that would warn the operators if they were leaving any detectable signature. The cloaking itself was achieved via the arrays of these brown-colored devices, which number 4 on each section for a total of 28. You can think of these as working a bit like shield projectors, but instead of blocking materials from passing through a protective layer, it instead lets everything easily pass through, allowing even light itself to pass through the ship without bouncing off. We only see things because light reflects off of objects and back into our eyes, so if the light passes through the ship, then we don't see it. As heat in the form of thermal radiation, radio signals used in radar, and visible light are all just parts on an electromagnetic spectrum, then it makes sense that if you can find a way to negate something's electromagnetic output, then it becomes effectively undetectable. Now of course, it is a bit all hand-wavy, and if you want an amazing breakdown of the real problems with stealth in space, I highly suggest you watch Isaac Arthur's video Space Warfare that explains why, at least in our universe, stealth in space is just about impossible. But moving towards the aft, we see that it has 4 thrusters, 2 main, and 2 auxiliary. For offense, it packs 2 proton torpedo launchers, located up front here, with an unknown maximum torpedo capacity, a point defense laser cannon turret manned by a clone trooper, and for countermeasures, a very handy set of 4 flare launchers. You don't see this a lot on Star Wars ships, but those flares are especially important on a stealth ship, as it buys you time to let one volley of missiles to track those flares, while your cloaking tech goes through its 10-second startup time. By combining these features, Anakin was able to decloak, fire its torpedoes, and if fired on, launch those flares to eat up the enemy attack, and get that cloak generating while you relocated before the second enemy volley. If we look at the overall length of this ship, we see that it is 99.71 meters, or 327 feet long. This makes it about a third of the length of the Arquitens-class light cruiser, and more than 3 times the length of the LAAT gunship. And at a height of 13 meters or 43 feet tall, it was about 2 Wookiees taller than the AT-TE. Now before I talk about its brief history, I do want to do a bit of speculating on the purpose behind those clone troopers' strange helmets. They are stealth ops clone troopers, which comes with a difference in paint color, but what looks really odd are those Princess Leia buns on the side of their head. It caught my eye that they look a lot like the same shape of the cloaking projectors on the ship itself. Just as the ship has a panel on each side, these troops have one on each side of their helmet. It may just help to work with the ship to cloak their own presence while sitting inside of it, but I was thinking it may mean that these troops can go invisible. We know personal cloaking devices are a thing, individual assassins like Rook had one, so it is reasonable to think that a Republic military that could make a stealth ship could also provide these elite stealth op troops with their own cloaking devices. I really hope that's true, as the badassery of that would offset the otherwise silly appearance. As for its history, it made its first battlefield appearance over Christophsis, a CIS fleet involving several Lucrehulks, Providence-class dreadnoughts, and regular-sized Providence-class carrier destroyers, was starving the population of this Outer Rim world. Skywalker was tasked with using this prototype to deliver aid to Senator Bail Organa, but he knew Admiral Trench had to be addressed. The infamous CIS strategist reveals that he had fought against stealth ships in the past, but Republic Intelligence points out that they were all capital ships, and having a cloaking device on such a small ship was almost unheard of. Anakin deduces that the only thing that could still be detectable would be his magnetic signature, and of course devises a dangerous plan of attack. When Admiral Trench fires his tracking torpedoes, Anakin is able to bring the stealth ship around towards the dreadnought while it is recharging its shields. Anakin skids the stealth ship off of the ironically named Invincible, which was unable to get those shields up, and took these massive torpedoes to its bridge. It should be pointed out that Trench did not die here, but that is a story for another day. So that's it for its history, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. The stealth ship is based on a submarine, with everything from its elongated design to its sonar blip screens and the accompanying iconic sounds. And the episode Cat and Mouse was inspired by movies like Das Boot and The Hunt for Red October. That being said, I still disagree that this is the Star Wars equivalent of a submarine. The episode is great and I love the submarine reference, but if you watched our video asking why there are no submarines in Star Wars and how that could work, then you know that I pointed out that a sub's relationship to other ships and planes is fundamentally different than the relationship that all air-dwelling ships and planes have to each other. A plane can just crash into a ship because they are in the same medium, namely the air, but can't crash into a submarine because of the difference in the medium in which it is in. In Star Wars, for this comparison, hyperspace's relationship to real space is more like the difference between air-dwelling and sea-dwelling ships. This is why I think of the stealth ship as better compared to a stealth plane, like if a B-2 bomber could also become invisible not just to radar, but invisible to our eyes as well. In the show, they worry about CIS ships accidentally crashing into the stealth ship. It's not in a different area exclusive to the stealth ship, like how a submarine is in a different space to all other non-submarines. The Star Wars stealth ship is just like every other ship, it's just that it can go invisible. And this battle takes place in the year 21 BBY, and it's cool to note that this is the first time that Anakin and Yularen work together, a relationship that would span the next couple of decades. So that's it for the stealth ship, but more important than all that, remember, never underestimate a Skywalker, and the Force will be with you. Always. Whether you're a young slave boy in a Naboo starfighter, an emotionally unstable fanboy of that slave, or an Imperial allied Mandalorian, spinning is always a good trick. The Fang fighter, also known as the Protectorate fighter, is a very unique starfighter designed and used exclusively by the Mandalorian Protectors. The Protectors were an ancient group of royal guards for the ruler of the Mandalorians, who was known by the title of Mandalore. With the weakened state of Mandalore after the events of the Clone Wars, many of these noble warriors took a knee and dedicated their service to the Empire. As Imperial allies, the Protectorate was allowed to use Mandel motors to openly produce these ships, whereas other Mandalorian craft like these that we have covered in other videos were produced partially in secret and sold to criminals and rebels on the side. Being legal, they could continue the production of this Clone Wars era veteran ship. Mandel Motors, in conjunction with the Celestin company Surosub, were able to create this starfighter at a final production cost of 185,000 credits, making it more expensive than an X-Wing and greater than 3 times the cost of the TIE Fighter. But those credits got you one of the most aggressive and nimble ships in the galaxy. Its top atmospheric speed of 900 km per hour, or 559 miles per hour, is a little slower than average, but its ability to rotate its wings is incredibly useful. Most starfighters have laser cannons in a fixed location, meaning the pilot has to move their whole ship to line up shots. You could just have the laser cannons move independently of the wing, but even that wouldn't give you the inescapable circle of death that is created by getting these wings to spin around the cockpit. With the Fang fighter, you simply have to line up the enemy in front of you, then fire your 2 wing-mounted light laser cannons while spinning, and your target is trapped. They can't move up, down, left, or right. You, however, can just turn the Fang fighter to any direction, causing the wall of plasma to smash into them. Or if you want to just use this laser fire cone to hold them in position, you could fire your ventrally located hidden proton torpedo. The mobility of these wings was also a crucial aspect in making it so agile. By moving its wings from horizontal to vertical, it could pass right through the formations of enemy starfighters. This ability to keep the cockpit stationary at the center while spinning the wings around you is incredibly difficult for the pilot, something that many Rebel pilots complained about with the V-Wing. But in the right hands, it was incredibly useful on both offense and when trying to evade through difficult terrain or through space debris. Then consider the fact that its overall profile was very small. Its official stats say it's only 6 meters long, or about 20 feet, but I'd say it looks closer to the length of an X-Wing, which is 12.5 meters or 41 feet. An A-Wing is 9.6 meters long in both canon and Legends, so I don't see how the Fang fighter is smaller than that. In their defense, perhaps they were just measuring the body. But no matter what, it can essentially modify its profile by changing the wing positions, and the overall height of this ship is ridiculously small. That, I would agree, is about the same as an A-Wing. In this clip, you can see that even with its landing gear down, this starfighter is shorter than a Mandalorian, and just barely taller than a Gonk droid. So it has a deadly cone of laser fire, a small and adjustable profile, and is also very maneuverable due to the fact that these 2 ion engine arrays are on those adjustable wings. Change the position of the wing, and you change the direction of the thrust by outputting more to one side versus the other, so that you can make remarkably quick turns in any direction. The Fang fighter also has a Class 2 hyperdrive, more than adequate for quickly jumping in and out of hyperspace for hit-and-run missions. Combine all of these abilities with the fact that each of the Mandalorian Protector Fang pilots were trained by the infamous Fen Rao, and you can see why it was so easy for them to destroy an entire unit of Rebel A-Wings. With all these features, it's no wonder that it was used from the time of the Clone Wars, then as Imperial allies, and some later would be used by the Rebel Alliance. That's it for its history, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. It was first introduced on January 26, 2016 on the same day in the comic Kanan 10 First Blood, and the Rebels TV show episode The Protector of Concord Dawn. Later details would be added via the Star Wars X-Wings miniature game and the Star Wars Commander video game. So that's it for the Fang fighter. Let me know if you guys think this ship has a great design, or is just silly, in the comments down below. But most important of all, remember, spinning is an essential space combat tactic, and the Force will be with you, always. What's up, Meta Nerds? This video is about one of the most obscure and strangest ships in the galaxy, the Dusty Duck. This ship takes an interesting path into canon both in-universe with a route from Nar Shaddaa, Tatooine, attacks by Maul, and eventual appearance on Jakku. But it also has a fascinating out-of-universe path that we will cover in the behind-the-scenes facts at the end. In Legends, the Dusty Duck story starts on Nar Shaddaa. Its owner was Naimish Dim, one of millions of smugglers on what was considered to be the shadiest place in the galaxy. His Paloic race was mainly known to other galactic citizens as cantina singers, but with this light freighter, Dim hoped to make enough money to move his family to a more respectable world. By cobbling together parts of scrap ships, he eventually finished his masterpiece. 3 enormous legs were salvaged by walkers and acted as landing gear. Its main engine would be taken from a thruster cluster of a much larger freighter. If you look at Corellian ships, you can see that they have this uniform airlock that makes docking easier and both comfortable to enter and exit through. You really appreciate that when you don't have it. As you can see, the Duck here just used what appear to be either door hatches to tanks, or what we see on some small starfighters. Up top appears to be the main reactor, or perhaps a rudimentary hyperdrive. A working shield generator and all the required projectors would likely have been the most difficult parts to scavenge, so it appears that Naimish instead coated the ship with thick plates of durasteel. Small thrusters line the ventral side for descent control and liftoff, and for changing directions in space. And I would expect that these flared out panels have repulsor lifts in them to help further control it in atmosphere. The final product stood over 16 meters or 52 feet tall, placing it in between an AT-ST and AT-AT, and more than twice the height of the quad jumper. Naimish had never been more proud, and with his daughter Anisha, he would start smuggling across the galaxy. She too loved the ship, even if it was so unreliable that her father once said, "Ducks are not meant for flying, at least not for too long." Essentially, it would put everything it could into takeoff, and then pray to the Force that they could make small adjustments in space in order to reach their target. Though it would often crash land on remote worlds, when just a few misfires of the thrusters allowed it to succumb to a planet's gravitational pull. Young Anisha saw all this as just an adventure, but the often shady investors that used her father's smuggling service disagreed. One client was fed up with the delays, and as her father unloaded the cargo, he was fatally stabbed in the back. By this time, Anisha had become quite the pilot, and was allowed to leave with the old jalopy that was her family's entire inheritance. She too would have to take up odd jobs, but never gave up on revenge. When the bounty hunter Rango Tell eventually caught her father's killer, the two fell in love and used the Dusty Duck to hunt down more contracts. This is what brought the ship to Mos Espa, where the couple hired a handful of dumb series pit droids on repulsor platforms to fix up the ship. But now, enter Darth Maul. While tracking Queen Amidala to Naboo, the Sith deployed several Dark Eye probe droids. One of them spotted the Jedi that was known to be protecting the Queen, and tracked them as they were walking towards a strange-looking ship. The last thing the probe saw was a streak of a green lightsaber, but as Maul set out on his Bloodfin speeder bike, he thought about how this odd-looking vessel would be the perfect place to inconspicuously hide a Queen. Maul snuck onto the craft and found Anisha alone. The terrifying Zabrak interrogated her about Amidala's location, before growing frustrated with her answers and killing her. That same afternoon, her lover Rango Tell was killed when his target got the jump on him in a Mos Espa alleyway. This left the Dusty Duck without an owner, and then it started to collect rumors as a ghost ship. The pit droids had been programmed with such a long list of repairs to make that they kept working on this ship for months while not a single inhabitant of the ship was seen. This may have scared the local slave kids for a while, but this is Tatooine after all, so someone eventually risks stealing it. Its exact path is unknown, but it eventually makes its way to Jakku, another dusty world for the Dusty Duck. By then it would be known as the Droid Scout Ship, because of all things it was actually automated and working as a scout ship searching for remote planets. Its crew was a loading droid known as F3ZK, or Fez, who came to be captured by Tito while searching the starship graveyard. BB-8 intervenes and Fez is able to make it back to the mysterious ship, where the ship takes off into the distance to serve its unknown master and continue on its unknown mission. So that's it for the Dusty Duck, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. The ship appeared in a deleted scene for episode 1, a ship that would have shown why Qui-Gon and Anakin were already running from Maul. But it was removed as it clashed with the more emotional farewell between Anakin and Shmi. The history of this tale is that StarWars.com had a thing called What's the Story, where fans could submit backstories to become official canon. Greg Mitchell was a horror writer and Star Wars fan that was happy to find that his submission had been accepted. He referenced another fan-accepted story about Rango Tell, and wanted to work in an urban legend aspect to this ship, having its owners be killed and ghost story rumors being started. Later, the ship itself would be canonized via the book BB-8 on the Run, a young reader's book released on September 1st, 2017. Did you guys know this ship existed, or did you ever see that deleted scene? Definitely let me know what you guys think about this ship and its story down in the comments below. But most important of all, remember, ghost stories don't scare off Tatooine shipjackers, and the Force will be with you, always. 1 year after the Battle of Yavin, the Alliance to restore the Republic was in open war with the Empire. After the destruction of the first Death Star, many oppressed beings across the galaxy flocked to the rebellion. And the secret facility that helped to train a lot of these recruits was none other than an old Clone Wars era Lucrehulk. If you watched our in-depth breakdown video, you know that these were originally large cargo haulers. They also happen to be perfect for carrying the ships and vehicles of the CIS military. Thousands of X-Wings could fit inside of a Lucrehulk, while also having plenty of room to house all of these new recruits. The cargo hauler had a relatively fast Class 2 hyperdrive, and thus many were believed to have been commandeered upon hearing that the CIS was destroyed. The CIS leadership had been eliminated all at once on Mustafar, but the commanders of individual Lucrehulks were stuck with the decision to either turn themselves over to the Republic, or try and hide. Lucrehulks are as wide as Manhattan and about 1/6 as long, but that is still pretty small when you're talking about hiding at some obscure part of the universe. Set this thing down on a dead moon in some backwater system, around an asteroid belt, or even just in the middle of empty space not well traveled, and I think you'd be just fine. Maintenance would of course be a problem, but presuming that you would have a full loadout when you vanished, the commander would have millions of credits in military-grade equipment, stuff that you could easily sell to pirates or small planetary governments, or just use this opportunity to take over your own obscure part of the galaxy. Whatever the case, the rebellion's need to work in obscurity brought them into the path of this old Lucrehulk. By having modified X-Wings that could be remote operated, the rebels were able to train countless new pilots without losing any. In fact, Lucrehulk Prime, as this base was called, is under the command of General Hera Syndulla. In this panel, we can see that her incredible piloting skills were used to steer X-Wings back into the hangar bay safely via this remote VR system. Her talents, combined with this system, meant that she could be flying 6 X-Wings at a time. Now I would imagine that some of the Lucrehulk's armament were modified to be less than lethal, as the massive amount of assault laser cannons, quad laser batteries, and turbo lasers would make for intense combat flight training. The Lucrehulk seen during the blockade over Naboo wasn't even as strong as the Clone Wars upgraded versions, so if you could successfully get past this Lucrehulk's defenses, then you were more than ready to take on Imperial Star Destroyers. Though the amount of damage done to the Empire by these pilots once they left is hard to quantify, the base itself was involved in a major attack on a crucial Imperial asset. Hive Base 1 appears to be built from CIS core ships, which themselves were modified from the control core of the Lucrehulk. Dr. Aphra was able to use Hera as a sort of Trojan horse, knowing the rebels would track her via her command plaque, bringing the Lucrehulk into conflict with the Imperials. Now with the proper tools, they could rip out the main core of this Hive archive with the cargo ship's massive front claws. The X-Wing pilots would then pull the actual archives out, right before this station that was crucial to the Tarkin initiative was blown apart. What happened to this Lucrehulk after this event is unknown, and I think it is interesting to wonder how many rebel Lucrehulks existed. There was one that was used to attack the Death Star in Legends, but it is unknown if that story will come back in canon, or with a simple name change, could be this same ship. So that's it for the Rebel Lucrehulk. Let me know what you guys think about the Rebels using old CIS vehicles, and if you hope to see more of this kind of stuff in future Star Wars canon material. Definitely let me know in the comments down below. But most important of all, remember, good technology never goes to waste, and the Force will be with you, always. What's up, meta nerds? This video is all about a rare type of ship, a space station flagship. The Star Home is a castle complex that sits atop a star carrier/destroyer. Developed by the remote but technologically advanced people of the Hapes cluster, the Star Home was the flagship of the Hapan Queen Mothers. There's a lot going on here, so let's just start with its overall size. With a diameter of 2,500 meters or 1.55 miles, it was more than 1.5 Imperial 1 class Star Destroyers across. For reference, if it were to land here on Earth, it would stretch from the White House to the Capitol building. At 1,250 meters or 0.77 miles from base to Castle Spire, it would be more than twice the height of the Burj Khalifa, or nearly 3 times the Empire State Building. Now all of that is protected by your standard deflector shield generator like you would find on Star Destroyers, but it also had a molecular shield generator that helped to increase the bonds of all the material that went into its hull. The majority of this ship hull was actually basalt, a type of rock formed by lava, and which symbolized the royal family. This might not be the most practical construction material, but it certainly made a statement, and as long as the molecular shields were keeping everything rigid, then it would work just fine. Each of these legs housed enormous tractor beam projectors that could push or pull against the surface independently in order to ensure a perfect landing. This of course could also be used to pull friendly ships into positions, or rip ships apart by pulling large capital ships in 5 different directions. This underside is where its 4 hyperdrive engines were located, which combined to a rating of a Class 1 hyperdrive. That's faster than the ISD, and tied with the Venator, and even some of the most nimble starfighters. But also keep in mind that it may be much faster than this, as each of its 4 hyperdrives is equal to the one found in the Victory-class Star Destroyer. Its sublight speed is unknown, but generated from a ring of 24 thrusters that encircled the Royal Complex. Each could fire independently, and like the tractor beams, helped to make this ship surprisingly maneuverable. To protect all that, the Queen had a complement of 60 Mytil starfighters, 20 turbolasers, and 20 laser cannons. Those fighters were very advanced with TIE fighter speeds and X-Wing firepower and durability. And though not as much overall firepower, it had more turbolasers than the Venator, and with the laser cannons and fighters to take out opposing starfighters, this floating fortress could stand its own in a fight. To run it all, there was a crew of 740, including 500 engineers, 90 starfighter pilots, 50 command staff, and 100 guards for the royal family. Speaking of which, that massive castle complex had apartments for 600 nobles and their retainers, and a total guest capacity of 2,000. On board, there were enough supplies to feed all these people for 5 standard years, and the cargo capacity was 7,000 tons, a weight equal to 8,750 dewbacks, which is just enough for a royal party. But as badass as the scene of a conquering queen sitting at the end of a long table chomping down on a dewback drumstick as she viewed enormous space battles through the castle viewport is a bit over-romanticized. It was not intended to be involved in full-scale space battles. All these shields and weapons were so that it could survive a battle and escape into hyperspace so that the royalty could live to rule another day. And this strategy works pretty damn well, given that it lasted over 4,000 years. Built just after the Mandalorian Wars, so sometime around 3,960 BBY, it was built as an exact replica of the Fountain Palace on Hapes, the capital of the Hapes Consortium. The palace structure was carved out from the surrounding basalt, so when the Queen made her space station palace, it too would be made from the same material. Hollowing out the legs and main body of this ship was an incredible feat of engineering. Every one of the consortium's 63 worlds dedicated labor, materials, and machines to complete the effort, and then once it was finished, each of these worlds also sent over treasures and artifacts that were stored in the royal vault. These would be brought out on display in front of dignitaries, and all combined to be a stunning display of the Queen Mother's rule. This ship was an engineering marvel that most of the galaxy didn't even know about, since the transitory mists almost completely cut off the Hapes cluster. But of course, some smugglers and adventurers stumbled in and out of this area, spreading wild stories of a space station that was carved out of a mountain. These accounts were always dismissed, until Queen Ta'achum tracked down her missing son, Prince Isildur. Once she took the castle ship past the transitory mists and into the galaxy at large, she figured the seal had been broken and they might as well introduce themselves to the New Republic. In 8 ABY, one of the galaxy's most unique ships entered space above Coruscant, a sight that was alien even for the diverse species of the galactic capital. The final fate of this ship, and whether it survives on to this day, is still unknown. So that's it for its history, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind-the-scenes stuff. There is a bit of in-universe mystery surrounding this ship. Some that have studied this Hapen space station claim that it may very well be the original Palace. It is believed that the castle complex may separate into a detachable unit that would link up with the massive legs. Accounts of just the castle itself appearing on different worlds would seem to back this, but either way, the fact that the Queen's castle was so mobile and stunning incited jealousy in leaders across the galaxy. This ship first appeared in the book The Courtship of Princess Leia, but was expanded upon in the Essential Guide to Characters and Vehicles and Vessels, the Star Wars Encyclopedia, Kraken's Threat Dossier, and Ladies First, which often have conflicting stats on this ship. It has also appeared in several Star Wars themed mods, which include a lot of other cool Hapen ships. But that's it for the Star Home. But most important of all, remember, that's no mountain, and the Force will be with you, always. What's up, meta nerds? This video is all about the Bratok-class gunship, also known as the Dornian gunship. It was manufactured by the obscure company Dornian Brahocket Fleet Works Conglomerate for use in their independent planetary defense navy of Doran, a planet which resisted inclusion in the Empire, but were in a part of the galaxy that was too remote for Palpatine to really care about. The cost is unknown, but at a length of 90 meters, or 295 feet, it was about 3.5 U-wings long, while at a height of 19 meters, or 62 feet, it was nearly as tall as 3 LAATs. And at a width of 37 meters, or 121 feet, it was nearly a sandcrawler across. This ship was equipped with a Class 1 hyperdrive, the same speed found in the Venator-class Star Destroyer, and it was protected with shielding. Its armament included 8 double turbolaser cannons, with 8 concussion missile launchers, making it very deadly in its anti-starfighter role. What also happened to make this a great gunship was the fact that it could carry 2 starfighters, attached to the underside via a pair of clamps, and during the time of the Galactic Civil War, these were usually T-65B X-Wings. The ship required a crew of 75, and a really interesting feature of the Bratok is that the hull is coated in silver in order to reduce the effects of solar radiation. As for its history, after the Dorans decided to resist the Empire, they began building up a navy, helping them secure their independence up through the Battle of Yavin. Their alliance with the rebels led to the donation of 3 of these gunships to General Jan Dodana's Masasi group, which was located on Yavin. The first time they were used to aid the rebels was during the Battle of Atollon in 2BBY, where the Phoenix Cells base was ambushed by Grand Admiral Thrawn. The Orion was the ship destroyed by TIE fighters, while the other 2 survived the retreating forces that returned to the base, but as Thrawn's ground forces closed in, the 2 gunships tried escaping with the Ghost, but were destroyed before leaving atmosphere. 2 years later, in 0BBY, 3 Dornian gunships were present during the Battle of Scarif, where they were mainly used to take out enemy TIE fighters. Once the Devastator arrived and cut off their retreat, one of the gunships was able to avoid colliding with the Star Destroyer, and able to escape to safety. One of these Dornian gunships was named the Apollina's Promise, and was used to defend the CR-90 corvette used by Twilight Company. By the year 4 ABY, 4 of these ships rendezvoused with the Alliance fleet near Sullust before launching an attack on the second Death Star. Carrying out their role of starfighter defense, they cleared out many TIEs as the Millennium Falcon made its way into the superweapon. And years later, in 34 ABY, Akbar states that the Dornians are still using this gunship. So that's it for its history, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. This ship was first introduced in Return of the Jedi, where the only name for it was just ROG-BG ship, which stood for the title of the movie, and its creator Bill George, but the reason why we don't see it shown prominently on screen is because the art director Joe Johnston didn't think it looked good enough. It didn't get its name Dornian until a member of StarWars.com named Elo137 entered into a lore-making competition where you had to link background objects in the movies to obscure references in the EU. Being accepted, this name was first introduced in the canon with the Lost Stars book in 2015, and then in 2017, it got the designation Bratok-class gunship via the book Star Wars Rebel Files. So that's it for the Dornian gunship, but most important of all, remember, there's always a chance that you can name something in the Star Wars universe, and the Force will be with you. Always. What's up, meta nerds? This video is all about the Republic's Tug 314, one of the many unsung heroes of the Clone Wars. When you think of amazing galactic-scale warfare, you probably think of Star Destroyers and starfighters blowing each other to bits, but the tugboat's role is crucial to a properly running military. Though they may not get a lot of screen time, the galaxy is full of spaceports, each with its own small fleet of Tug 314s to make sure that vessels are safely docked so that they are properly maintained and refueled. We saw a number of them at Valor Station and the Kaleida Shoals Republic Medical Station, assisting in the flow of traffic to and from these sites. By taking a look at multiple sides of this ship, you can see the entire vessel is dedicated to the enormous engines and its pair of tractor beam projectors. The size of these allowed the Tug to move around enormous capital ships like the Venator, while being refined enough to detect individual droids in debris fields. The way it worked is the tractor beam allowed it to grab other ships and make small manipulations to its direction, while these two pairs of thrusters generated enough force to move around destroyers. The reason for the visual difference between these two tugs may just be due to it being a newer model, or because it was around larger ports like Valor Station, so it needed to contain stronger engines for the more frequent movements of Venators, whereas the tugs at medical stations were mostly dealing with the smaller Pelta-class medical frigate. The one seen at the Kaleida Shoals station does appear to be a bit smaller, and although the structure of the tractor beam projectors are roughly the same, you can see that the ones from Valor Station are a bit longer. It also has these airlocks on the sides, and a completely different cockpit style, while the medical tug has this external dish, and the Valor variant must have contained communication devices built in. We have official stats for the smaller tug at 32.27 meters, or 122 feet long, making it a Wookiee shorter than the Millennium Falcon. At a height of 12 meters, or 39 feet, it was taller than the AT-ST, but shorter than the AT-AT. And at 12.5 meters, or 41 feet wide, it was a Jawa plus a Porg wider than the X-Wing. And this is just an estimate, but the Valor variant appears to be about 45 meters long, about 40% the length of the Consular-class Cruiser, or about 3.5 ARC-170s. Though often away from any of the action of the Clone Wars, when the Geonosian brainworms commanded Barriss Offee to attack Ahsoka, she damaged the controls on the Pelta-class frigate they were taking to the Kaleida Medical Station, almost resulting in a massive collision. If you watched our video on the Republic Medical Station, you know that these could contain up to 60,000 troops, so the pair of tugs that were sent out that day truly prevented a catastrophe. In this scene, we can actually see the clone pilot's unique armor with the Republic logo and yellow details on the helmet, but also this cool view of the control panel. A lot of Arabesh here, but I went ahead and translated it so that we can see what's going on. It says access control over the top, with 7 different function buttons on the side, and a center control that reads T 1 through 6, then the options level, control, and vortex. And it also has a disengage button over here. The pilot was trying to stop a barreling frigate and hits function 6 and then control. We can't know for sure, but these dots represent the thrust level, which is all the way up, and perhaps the control option is for using the tractor beams to get the best hold of a ship, whereas level would control the X and Y axis, and vortex would let you spin it. But definitely let me know what you guys think about it in the comments down below. We don't get to see inside the tug at Valor Station, but we do get to see how it was used in salvaging wrecks, having lights and scanners that could pick up valuable assets, like the true hero of the galaxy known as R2-D2. So that's it for its history, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. These tugs actually address, in a very funny way, a problem that a lot of people have with Star Wars ships. According to the physics from our universe, most Star Wars ships have no way of slowing down or turning because they only have thrusters at the rear. It isn't like they have air or wind to help them turn or slow down like a plane or a boat could. So if you think about it like that, tugs would have had to have been around since the beginning of Star Wars space travel. It also means that realistically, every docking should be a lot like the one with the brainworm incident. There was also another tug that was used during the Imperial era, the much smaller CT-11 space tug. So that's it for the interstellar tugboat. But most important of all, remember, save some love for the ships that keep the war machine moving. And the Force will be with you, always.
I booked passage on this transport!
No planetary travel without a chain code.
But I have to get on this ship!
What's up, meta nerds? In this video, we'll pull from every resource to completely understand the Snivians, a mammalian humanoid species native to Kedomia Prime, which present a unique and fascinating case study in species adaptation and cultural development. Kadome Prime, located at grid coordinates R3 in the Outer Rim territories, within the Kartalos sector, is a frigid world characterized by its harsh, intolerably cold winter. Its landscape is dominated by tundra plains, and it features an extensive system of subterranean caverns. These caverns provided crucial shelter for the Snivian during the planet's sub-freezing winters. Often simply called Kadome, lies along the northern end of the major hyperlane, the Hydian Way, and it is orbited by a single moon. They stand at an average height of 1.4 meters, about 4 feet 8 inches, making them shorter than many other humanoid species. Their appearance is marked by large nostrils and a protruding lower jaw and 2 small tusks. They exhibited a range of hair colors from brown to black, and display a wider variety in skin color and eye color. They were capable of speaking Galactic Basic, but they also have their own language which involves snorts through their nostrils. And most are fluent in both their native Snivian language and Basic, though they tend to be literate only in Snivian, and when speaking Basic they have a distinct nasal accent.
I want what I'm owed. We had a deal. Someone will hear you.
Their fascination with galactic culture makes them eager to engage in Basic with non-Snivians, and they are particularly delighted when others attempt to communicate in their native language. But of course there were some Snivians that felt that speaking Basic was betraying their culture. And their homeworld is very cold, but they didn't develop thick coats of fur to keep their bodies warm. Instead, they survive by having a unique skin that allows them to exist in sub-freezing environments, having many layers of dense skin with special membranes that control the opening and closing of the pores. The membrane network can be consciously controlled by the Snivian to let body heat escape in warm climates, or to trap in heat in the cold Kadome winters. But their body temperature is regulated by this membrane network, which conducts thermal energies efficiently through their bodies. And they don't have to worry about frostbite. They have a sort of sacrificial layer of skin on the outside, with their final layer just being dead skin cells. In general, they're known to be gentle, insightful people, as entire tribes would have to be packed in together for extended periods in those subterranean homes during the winter months. But despite this gentle nature being generally true, there are some intensely bloody moments in their history. Every time they give birth to one male and one female. This was the genetic norm for thousands of years, at least since the Snivians evolved from hunters on the tundra plains of Kadome. But in the past, genetic mutations, a flaw in the quote blood code, sometimes caused male twins to be born. This is so rare that there are only 200 documented incidents of this in the past 2 millennia. When you had 2 males during this birth, one would always be a standard, healthy child, and one would always have a specific genetic flaw. This flaw didn't produce any visual differences, but they had a 1 in 3 chance of mutating into a personality-afflicting disorder. In most cases, this led to sociopathic behavior and created killers among the peaceful people. In the past, 3 charismatic but truly evil rulers have risen as a result of this defect. The first 2 were taken out by a popular revolt, but the last, Zeroldspadar, was felled by off-world forces of the Old Republic. Before the advent of genetic engineering, there was a practice of keeping twin males incarcerated and monitored. You had to lock them both up, not knowing which one was the evil twin. If sociopathic tendencies appeared, the offending twin underwent a process of personality reprogramming, which included mental conditioning, but also seems to be a sort of lobotomy, as they were, quote, transformed into simple-minded shadows of what they once were. And think about how horrifying that would be for the healthy twin there, who is also being constantly monitored and had to worry about some action of theirs being misinterpreted, from those constantly monitoring you looking for any sign that you might be the next mass killer. But the Snivians eventually mastered genetic engineering, so that these male twin births were minimized. They unraveled and stabilized the blood code, and their species prospered, stretching their civilization across the 4 habitable worlds of their system. But then they fell into the hands of the Thalassian slavers. In this vile trade, the Thalassians captured and sold the Snivians to others who would use their skins for industrial purposes, having that unique combination of being incredibly dense and those thermal insulating pores. It was only because of the intervention of the Old Republic that they were saved from being hunted to complete extinction. But this wasn't the last of their challenges. As they became more ingrained in the larger galactic community, it's been shown that centuries of hyperspace travel may have undone the genetic corrections of the past and reawakened the blood code. And of course, Snivian scientists are carefully watching to make sure no twin brothers rise again. On-world, their government model is a participatory democracy, with members being elected onto a ruling council called a Chevron. From there, an executing officer is voted, based entirely on artistic skill. The Chevron is elected every 12 Snivian years, with the executive being elected every year of the Chevron's rule. they were able to develop sublate space travel on their own, but adopted hyperdrive technology from the more advanced alien species of the Republic. And while Kandosii never became an industrial hub, they were renowned for their artistic achievements and have traded and sold their works across the entire galaxy. And although that usually meant sculpture, literature, and even some philosophy, they are often overlooked for their engineering, even if that wasn't the center of their civilization. But because of that blood code issue, Snivians concentrated on genetic science, with their work rivaling that of the Bith and the Lurians. But there was a major difference in that the Snivian genetic sciences were all reactive in nature. They were formed to defeat specific flaws, not to explore knowledge for its own sake. And as a result, many Snivian research projects with great potential were stopped once specific problems were solved. Other species like the Bith have used Snivian science as a starting point and carried that on for greater research projects and discoveries. Which, if you saw the Bith video, that became a nightmare or a utopia depending on how you look at it. But with their innate creativity, many traveled the galaxy simply to amass new experiences and live life to the fullest. But as a result, they're often found in fields that they are not equipped to handle, as they are attempting to build up their so-called mental furniture, living in different ways to be able to create their great art. But this is why you have many inept bounty hunters and smugglers that over the past have just been Snivians attempting to write poems on these professions. And it's part of the main reason why you always see them hanging around in cantinas. Like any good writer, they know that the bar is the best place to soak up stories and get new leads on life's next great adventure. For having a face like this, a lot of people don't realize that just about every Snivian you would meet is secretly in agony trying to realize their life's master work. And I'd imagine the cantina helps take the edge off in that regard as well. A typical lifespan was up to 105 standard years, which is a lot longer than most species. Because of the extreme cold and prolonged winters, it necessitated the Snivians spend extended periods in those subterranean caverns. This isolation and confinement played a significant role in nurturing their artistic talents. Here they would hone their skills across a broad spectrum of artistic mediums. They specifically excelled in holography, painting, sculpture, music, and literature, contributing significantly on a galactic level. They developed a unique form of art known as the trans novel, a culturally distinct genre that was effectively a multimedia product, with text and other artistic elements used in innovative ways. Even as technological advancements reduced the necessity of their traditional hibernation-like lifestyles, Snivians continued to value and practice these long-established cultural habits. This showed that even when they could dwell on the surface in modern heated buildings, perhaps something like a human's day-night cycle, this want to just go underground during the winter and produce art was entrenched at a biological level. And many Snivians, driven by their artistic passions, ventured across the galaxy to experience and understand the lives of potential subjects for their future works. This approach to art, characterized by immersive and sometimes perilous experiences, really shows just how dedicated they were to their craft. Other groups, like the Zygerians and the Karazaks, were also active in the slave trade in the Outer Rim. The involvement of various senators in the slavery ring prior to the Clone Wars really shows how they were being forsaken both by evil aliens and the galaxy-spanning government, making it nearly impossible to regulate and crack down on. And despite this betrayal by those on Coruscant and the government's inability to stop this, they did have an unwavering faith in the Republic, many joining the Coruscant security forces and bringing what power they could to try and protect their homeworld and sector. And though they would not play a major role in the Clone Wars, neither on the side of the Republic or CIS, likely because their world had no natural assets, we do see them in major events like the auctions involving Jedi Padawans, or in Chalmun's Cantina in Mos Eisley. There was also the bounty hunter Sinrich, who invented the holographic disguise matrix, seeing this high-tech engineering as a sort of art in its own right, and their involvement in the rebel cell known as the Spectres on Lothal. Tekiel and Zhutan were in Chalmun's Cantina during the true rise of Skywalker. They were involved in various aspects of the galaxy's underworld, most notably working for Jabba the Hutt. There was Sol Charlis, who was bullied on Dirk Teal, for obvious reasons, while the Snivian brothers Nod and Narb were criminals residing on the Colossus refueling station, a true embarrassment for these otherwise highly enlightened people. It really proved the old adage not to judge a book by its cover. That's it for the breakdown, and as for cool facts and behind-the-scenes stuff, they first made their appearance in A New Hope, their identity being further clarified in an entry about Sinrich in the official StarWars.com website. They would appear in Rise of Skywalker in 2019, portrayed by Jake Lunt Davies. And if you want to learn more about them, be sure to check out Complete Locations, Visual Encyclopedia, and the Ultimate Alien Anthology. Please hit that like button, subscribe to see more, and check out these videos, I'm sure you'll like them. But most important of all, remember, what some call a manic psychotic episode, Snivians just call performance art. And the Force will be with you, always. What's up, meta nerds? This video will be a complete breakdown of the Corporate Sector Authority, pulling everything from both Legends and canon to understand this unique part of the galaxy, and predict some things that we might see as it gets explored more. The first time the CSA was ever mentioned was in 1979 in the novel Han Solo at Star's End, so it's been in the lore since before Empire Strikes Back, and it would really get fleshed out a lot more in the 80s and early 90s, and it always felt like a more grungy, dystopian sci-fi area, not quite like the rest of the Star Wars galaxy, more focused on crime and corruption instead of the feud between the Jedi and Sith. This section of the galaxy officially became the Corporate Sector in 490 BBY, and was the direct result of the Outer Expansion Zone scandal 2 centuries earlier. Circa 700 BBY, the Expansionist Oligarchy, which is exactly what it sounds like, a collection of megacorps which achieved a level of power never before seen in the Republic, and who went out to set up monopoly rule of large areas of the galaxy. In the past, some might fear monopolies dominating a specific good or service, but at the solar system scale, these megacorps would take things like the company store practice to new levels. The entire marketplace of collections of solar systems could be under a sole supplier from one of these megacorps, and many of them would ironically form their own sort of union or lobby in order to wield influence against the Republic Senate. Workers complained that they were merely serfs, just above slaves, and that their only free choice was to go homeless, while on Coruscant these flyby star systems were ignored. And these corporations could point to true figures of ever-increasing quality of life, measured in everything from food options, technology, and even lifespan, as these worlds were mostly primitive or even uninhabitable before the megacorps arrived. When the Republic continued their push to civilize the galaxy, connecting everything with the non-stop construction of hyperlanes, they turned over management of the Outer Expansion Zone to the Expansionist Oligarchy in 719 BBY. Over the next couple decades, however, a dark aspect of space economics and galactic ecology was revealed. If you strip mine an entire world, worked its native population to death, and moved on to do this to an entire solar system, the cold vacuum of space didn't shed a tear. On a single world, the people and countries that shared it would often come to agreements on things since it all affected each other. Reckless abandon on your sector of the world, even if you owned it, would lead to someone coming to put a stop to it eventually. And even if they didn't, this perpetrator would have been killed from the results of their own actions, so it would resolve itself, whether it be nuclear war or environmental disaster. But a lifeless world keeps spinning around its star all the same. You could ravage an entire solar system, and it would still stay in its neat little orbit in the galaxy. And then so when the Expansionist Oligarchy found themselves with even more power, and even farther away from the core, their policies took on a whole new level of reckless abandon. Many of these people caught in the path were uncharted, and most of them were lost to history, with who knows how many native plant and animal life that were just considered useless on planet-wide operations, clearing them to make space for settlers, or dedicating a world completely to industrial production. It got so out of hand that even the corrupt senators back home got involved, and this experiment was put to an end. With the oligarchs seeming to have been broken up, fleets of Republic ships at a scale not seen since the Mandalorian Wars spread all throughout the expansion region to be a show of force. As like the later Trade Federation, the businesses did have to secure arms and eventually warships to protect their assets in this Wild West. But they were smart enough to respect the Republic authority and just adapt to the times. While the Republic tried to establish more social safety nets in these regions, the companies were still in power, just with more of a threat that the laws passed on Coruscant would actually now be enforced. And the Republic still sold off large contracts of space to the same companies, but now with direct Republic contacts. And this did seem to work to create a better balance of innovation and freedom, with less exploitation of entire star systems. These new sectors of land also paid a flat tax on all activity in the area, and again, really think of this at scale. The most powerful country on Earth doesn't even control 1/5 of the population or landmass, but a single business could operate like a government for dozens of systems. Instead of having the Republic getting involved to tax everything from sector, system, planet, and city level, they just paid a flat fee back to Coruscant and can work out the rates within the overall legal restrictions. But with this first shot across the bow of oligarchy, these titans secured a piece of the farthest out part of the Outer Rim, and at the very end of the Hydian Way. This super hyper route connected the entire galaxy, and was generally the quickest, easiest, and safest way to travel. The newly formed corporate sector would be a retreat for some of the richest people in the galaxy, and by the time of the Clone Wars it was considered an independent governmental zone, not under Republic control, and so it was similar to Hutt space. Even the Hutts knew that if something outrageously flagrant was done here, if someone kidnapped a senator and brought him into Hutt space, or was committing endless genocide within this sector, this would eventually get public opinion, and the Hutts expected Jedi to pay them a visit. But nobody would conflate that with the Republic being in charge there. In the corporate sector, the Republic credit was not used.
No weapons, no comms, no credit.
Instead, they used the Authority cash voucher, and their capital became AT-4, a world with blue-skinned near-humans, not Chiss or Pantoran, that moved here from the core around 20,000 years earlier. This became the capital of Cybot Galactica, the creator of everything from the 3PO and other protocol droids to workers, demolition, and military droids, the greatest rival to industrial automata. When the Clone Wars broke out, despite being in the CIS-controlled Outer Rim, they were left alone and able to remain neutral, I suspect on the direct order of Darth Sidious, as we will see Palpatine's intentions with this area. Because the heads of these companies did not get involved, after the Empire was formed, they were sold a bunch of the war surplus, everything from arms to at least 6 Requisite-class light destroyers, while most of the old CIS companies were nationalized or dissolved with their assets being handed out to loyal companies like Quad Drive Yards, Sienar Fleet Systems, and TAG Company. It was TAG who became close friends with the new Emperor, and was seen as instrumental in helping to expand the corporate sector authority. This would come to include 30,000 star systems, but still relatively small on the map, and was a concession on Palpatine's part. He knew that the marketplace was the best generator of new products and ideas, so he wanted to allow this zone to operate outside of his control. The Empire had plenty of firepower to take this region whenever it wanted. The only thing that he really worried about was that if the wealthy and powerful in Coruscant turned on him, maybe they could spark a rebellion or pull off an assassination. So there was always a dance with the CSA, and they also had an enormous influx of battle droids after the Clone Wars. Refitted to work on new systems, it still wasn't enough to take on the Empire, but incredibly scary for the CSA citizens. As the old separatist company, the corporate alliance's assets were taken in, negotiating a 3% tax on the sector's gross product, and another tithe on all materials and ore produced, in exchange for that droid army. This leftover army would be used to further consolidate all of the new space that they were granted, with several short, smaller wars popping up, with the Triani being able to hold out and broker a peace deal, while the discovery and attack of at least 11 sentient species were completely covered up. The Espos, or Boys in Brown, were the beat cops, and there are now these higher level, more refined looking authorities as well. They all had access to everything from the stun batons to armored walkers and gunships, sending out prisoners to the feared secret prison called Star's End, a spire on a desolate asteroid in wild space. The security division was the military, which patrolled their territory in fleets that were a combination of all sorts of stuff. Old CIS ships like Lucrehulks and dreadnoughts, alongside new Imperial Victory 1s, and for starfighters they mostly used the Mankvim 914 light interceptor. One of the most grievous crimes committed in this sector was sedition, plotting against your government, but as this oppressively corporate CSA org chart shows, your employer was the government, and forming a union was treason. What's funny is that during the humanocentric rule of the Empire, there was far greater alien equality in the CSA, an appeal that drew millions to this far-off sector, but they quickly realized that they traded out speciesism for classism. Citizenship was purchased, and was called shareholder rights, so all lower class and even most of the middle class laborers could work their entire life without officially being citizens. While the CSA would also buy slaves from abroad, enslave new populations they discovered within their borders, though most saw no major difference between the slave conditions and how the most poor non-citizen worker of the CSA lived, only making enough to eat for that day and owning no property. But at least the board meetings were a beautiful multicultural display of the most ruthless elite aliens of all shapes and sizes. There was one incident that did bring the Empire to come in like a blitzkrieg, following the Rebel escape during the Battle of Hoth. Turns out the magnetic pulse warheads used by the Rebel Alliance were sold out of this region, and making sure they set the tone, the Empire did an unprecedented move and took full control of Galactic Electronics Corporation, setting up shop on all of their land within this sector. After Endor, the CSA tried to remain neutral, selling off anything they could to the Imperial Remnant and New Republic. Many in the NR protested any alliance with the CSA, but then they would be conquered by Grand Moff Zing in 7 ABY, though it would only be in his control for a year when he died in 8 ABY. Curiously, the Yuuzhan Vong would not invade them, but this is likely just due to them being so far out on the fringes, as the New Republic wanted to unify the entire galaxy and dissolve the ancient oligarchy outpost. From around 20 ABY on, many of the companies were working with contacts from the Imperial Remnant in the unknown regions, growing what would become the First Order, with the express agreement that they would emerge to destroy the New Republic and ensure the protection of this autonomous sector. Enric Pride would rise in the ranks of the First Order and act as a supervisor in the CSA. Though when he was contacted by the Sith Eternal Cultist that was hunting down Rey, this whole dark side stuff was too much, and he cut off his relationship with the Jedi Hunter and warned him that he better stay out of the corporate sector. General Leia would reveal that Senator Ro Kintor was funneling credits from the CSA and First Order, while over on Canto Bight, the police department was given a list of VIPs from this sector that they were to never harass in any way whatsoever. The last we hear from the sector was a reckoning that was 700 years in the making, when in 44 ABY, a full-scale slave revolt erupted on all major cities across this sector, though whether the oligarchs found a way to stay in power is still unclear. Thanks for watching. If you want a lot more of this stuff, here are the sources from the novels and guidebooks. But most important of all, remember, the demiurge of the future will take the form of some far-off interplanetary corporation. And the Force will be with you. Always. What's up, meta nerds? This video is all about the Slave 2, and I will also go over the little information that exists on the Slave 3 and the Slave 4, all ships that were used by Boba Fett. The Slave 2 was Fett's Pursuer-class enforcement ship that was manufactured by Mandel Motors, a Mandalorian-run company that also produced the Captor-class battleship. Fresh out of the factory, a Pursuer-class cost 200,000 credits, about the cost of 3 TIE fighters, but Boba modified it to the point that it was worth an estimated 1.5 million credits. For reference, that's about twice the cost of the Slave 1. At a length of 30.1 meters, or 98 feet, it was about as long as a Y-wing plus a TIE fighter, and at a width of 11.5 meters, or 38 feet, it was about 3 huts across, while at a height of 10.6 meters, or 35 feet, it was an Ewok taller than an AT-ST. With a top speed of 1,000 kilometers per hour, or 621 miles per hour, it was as fast as the Slave 1 and the Y-wing, but slower than an IG-2000. Its hyperdrive was slower than its predecessor, but the Class 1 was still faster than an Imperial-class Star Destroyer. For defense, it had incredibly powerful shield generators and sensor jamming equipment, while for offense, it had 2 blaster cannons, an ion cannon turret, tractor beam, and proton torpedo launcher at the rear, which was a perfect way to eliminate those quicker ships as they tried to catch up to the Slave 2. One of the most important differences was the 65 metric ton capacity, a weight greater than 16 banthas, which allowed Boba to store 3 months of consumables, as well as all of his regular cargo. If we take a look inside of this ship, we can see that there are 3 decks, with the bridge up top, and the lift tube that connected each level located right here. The middle deck contained a small storage area, followed by the kitchen, and then by Fett's personal quarters. Going down, we see the airlock, followed by the 5 holding cells, and the large cargo bay. And this support strut and stabilizing brace connected to the maneuvering thruster cluster, which contained a series of ion thrusters, which gave the ship finer controls when used in concert with the 2 main ion engines. The history of this ship has it starting out as a police patrol craft that was used on Mandalore and Mandalorian-controlled territories. Fett was able to purchase one, and then went about installing all sorts of counter-theft measures and turned the interior of these cells into their own little high-security prisons, with some reports claiming that they had molecularly reinforced walls, gravity restraints, and force fields. These were particularly important when you consider that these cells needed to contain a Wookiee, as Fett was determined to get revenge on Han Solo for what happened at the Great Pit of Carkoon. Whereas the ubiquity of the YT-1300 helped to keep Han under the radar, the Slave 1 was too unique, and so that's why Fett settled on the less flashy Pursuer class. After some time, he was able to track down Solo, and finally sprung his trap on Nar Shaddaa. The Force willed that Solo would escape, and the pursuit that followed brought the pair to the planet Biss, where Han was able to use his Rebel Alliance connections to get them to raise the planetary shields, just as the Slave 2 was about to enter atmosphere, causing Fett to smash into it and break off the stabilizing wing, only just barely surviving due to his ship's own military-grade shields. After this event, Fett decided he would retire the Slave 2, and he moved on to the Slave 3, whose only information I could find was simply that it exists, but after this was destroyed or abandoned, he moved on to the Slave 4. The Slave 4 was built by Kuat Drive Yards, and was an AI-ATI gunship, which was the exact same class as Jaster's Legacy, the original ship that was used by Jango Fett. Boba would use this ship for many years, until the year 21 ABY, when after mourning the death of his close friend, Fen Shaisa, he decided to abandon this ship on the planet Shogun. And the last we know of this long line of Fett's ships is that the Slave 4 was later discovered by Island Vale, who was actually Boba's daughter. So that's it for the Slave 2, 3, and 4. But most important of all, remember, even Boba couldn't beat the original, and the Force will be with you, always. A walker with sound dampening, thermal and electronic cloaking, and a stealth system that is usually reserved for starfighters. What's up, meta nerds? This video is going to be a short spotlight about a vehicle that most people have never heard about. The all-terrain Force Reconnaissance Walker, the AT-FRC. This comes from the Legends sourcebook Lead by Example, where we get a ton of cool details. It was made during the Clone Wars and designed as an improvement on the AT-RT. It ended up being about midway in size between the RT and the AT-ST, and is said to have a similar speed. So around 90 km per hour or 56 miles per hour, almost twice as fast as the armored assault tank. Like all the walkers, it was manufactured by Kuat Drive Yards, and despite all of its tech, it only cost 75,000 credits. Designed to be used by the ARC Troopers, it is specialized around stealth and efficient target elimination. 2 ARC Troopers would be seated in the cockpit, with the driver/gunner seated up high and towards the rear, and the dedicated reconnaissance systems operator seated lower and towards the front. His job was to use the state-of-the-art Fabritech Longview 341A sensor array to pick up on enemy comms and communicate that data back to HQ. This whole system was highly encrypted, and it is believed that the CIS never cracked this code throughout the war. They were never able to detect the intrusion. But in addition to concealing its comm presence, it also went through insane lengths to hide its physical presence as well. First off is the active sound baffling system, which was able to cancel out the noise of the engine and drive servos. This tech is similar to noise-canceling headphones and even technology in some cars, using speakers to send out the opposite of the waveform that was created by this walker stomping around. This minimizes the net sound wave. Then it had a dual thermal/EMP dampening system that was able to conceal some of the energy emissions, perhaps through a similar system sending out opposing electromagnetic waves. Then just to top it all off, there was an optical camouflage system. We have seen some personal cloaking devices that make you invisible to the eye, and you can also see them on larger ships like the prototype stealth ship, and starfighters like the TIE Phantom and the Scimitar. But with this walker purpose-built for ARC Troopers, we get what I believe is the only invisible walker. Keep in mind that because it could also cloak its thermal and electronic signature, and the fact that you can barely hear it stomping around, then the AT-FRC is almost completely undetectable. You can use thermal imaging to pick up a cloaked ship or person with a cloaked device, but that wouldn't work so well with this walker. So it's got its defense covered, but it also has some powerful offensive capabilities. A chin-mounted ball turret double-barreled auto blaster is designed to quickly rip through troops, and a rapid-fire concussion grenade launcher can blow apart light armor in seconds. So as you can see, this thing is mostly designed for reconnaissance deep behind enemy lines, and for eliminating any scouts or lookouts that may have discovered it. If it detected larger tanks or other heavy armor, it would most likely just try and remain undetected, and collect intel for other Republic forces. Some other interesting features is that if the reconnaissance system operator was ever incapacitated, the driver can take control of all the systems. And this walker contains an additional customizable hardpoint, allowing Republic forces to attach mission-specific hardware to the AT-FRC. All considered, it's a shame that we didn't see more of this stealth walker that was specifically designed for the elite ARC Troopers. It would live on into Imperial service as well, but the exact amount that survived decommission is unknown. So let me know what you think about this thing down in the comments, and if you hope to see it in the final season of the Clone Wars. But most important of all, remember, this is what happens when you let ARC Troopers pimp your walker, and the Force will be with you, always.